The morning sun filtered through the leaves of ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows on the dirt path that wound through the village of Willow's Rest. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and freshly turned earth, rustling the thatched roofs of cottages that seemed to have grown from the landscape itself. In this remote corner of the kingdom, far from the grand cities and bustling trade routes, life moved with the slow, steady rhythm of seasons rather than commerce. Valen stood before a small, weathered building at the village's edge, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed his work. The structure had once been a storage shed for farming tools, but over the past month, he had transformed it into something resembling a shop. Whitewash covered the exterior walls, though patches of gray would still peek through where his brush had missed. A single window, freshly cleaned, reflected the morning light. He wore simple linen trousers and a faded blue shirt, its sleeves rolled up to his elbows. An apron of sturdy brown cloth, already stained with various herbal residues, was tied around his waist. His hands, which had once gripped the hammer that forged the Sword of Dawn, the very blade that pierced the Demon King's heart, now held a wooden sign painted with careful, if somewhat uneven, letters. Valen's verdant bruise, it read in forest green paint. With a soft grunt of satisfaction, Valen lifted the sign and hung it from the iron hook he had installed above the door. The wood creaked slightly as it settled into place, swinging gently in the breeze. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his apron as he examined his handiwork. A small smile touched his lips, one that spoke of contentment rather than pride. This was what he had wanted, a quiet corner of the world where he could work with his hands without the weight of legends pressing down on him. Inside the shop, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating rows of glass bottles arranged on simple wooden shelves. Each bottle contained a liquid that shimmered with a soft, emerald glow, healing potions brewed from common herbs he had gathered along the roadside. Dandelion roots, plantain leaves, yarrow flowers, ingredients so mundane that most alchemists would scoff at them. Yet in Valen's hands, through the application of his divine craft deconstruction, they had become something more. The process was almost meditative for him. He would examine a handful of weeds, his divine ability activating without conscious thought, analyzing their properties down to the molecular level. Then, through focus alone, he would restructure their essence, enhancing their natural healing properties 100-fold while removing any toxic elements. No rare crystals, no dragon scales, no phoenix feathers, just common plants and his unwavering concentration. He had set the prices low, calculating only what would cover his modest living expenses and the cost of the bottles themselves. A basic healing potion, capable of mending deep cuts and broken bones within minutes, cost only 3 copper coins. To Valen, this seemed perfectly reasonable. He remembered the exorbitant prices charged by alchemists in the capital, where a similar potion might cost a silver piece or more, putting it out of reach for common folk. Here in Willow's Rest, where farmers earned maybe 10 coppers a day, his prices meant healing was accessible to all. As he arranged the bottles, ensuring each label was straight, the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his boots tracking in a bit of mud from the path. He was middle-aged, with sun-weathered skin and hands calloused from decades of labor. His name was Garrett, a local farmer who owned the fields north of the village. "Morning, Valen," Garrett said, his voice rough but friendly. He removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing thinning brown hair. "Saw your sign go up. Didn't know we had an alchemist in Willow's Rest." "Just a simple potion maker," Valen replied with a warm smile. He gestured to the shelves. "Healing brews, mostly. Made from local herbs." Garrett approached the counter, his eyes scanning the bottles with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Local herbs, you say? My wife uses yarrow for poultices, but it barely helps with scrapes." He picked up a bottle, holding it to the light. The liquid inside glowed with an inner luminescence that seemed to pulse gently. 3 coppers. That can't be right. The traveling alchemist who comes through every season charges 20 coppers for something that looks half as good. 3 coppers is fair, Valen said simply. The ingredients cost almost nothing, and the work, well, I enjoy it. Garrett's skepticism deepened. He had been a farmer long enough to know that if something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Yet there was something about Valen, a calm confidence in his eyes, the steady way he held himself, that gave Garrett pause. He had heard the rumors, of course. Whispers that this newcomer had once been someone important, a hero from the Great Wars. But Valen never spoke of it, and in Willow's Rest, a man's past was his own business. "My boy, Kellen," Garrett said after a moment, setting the bottle back on the counter. "He took a bad fall yesterday while repairing the barn roof. Landed on a broken rake handle. The wound's deep, and it's starting to fester. Old Mahilda's poultices aren't helping much. Valen's expression softened. Take a bottle. If it doesn't work, you owe me nothing. Garrett hesitated, then nodded. He fished 3 copper coins from his pocket and placed them on the counter. The metal clinked softly against the wood. I'll hold you to that promise, he said, though his tone held more hope than threat. He took the bottle and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Valen returned to his arranging, humming a tune he had learned long ago in a different life. Outside, the village began to stir. Children ran past the shop, their laughter echoing down the lane. An old woman with a basket of eggs nodded to him as she passed. Life in Willow's Rest continued its gentle pace. An hour later, the door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Garrett stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock. In his arms, he carried a young man of about 16, Kellen, presumably. The boy's right leg was wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, but he was conscious, his eyes wide with confusion. It worked, Garrett breathed, his voice trembling. By all the gods, it worked. He set Kellen down gently on the wooden chair Valen kept by the counter. The boy's color was good, his breathing steady. With careful hands, Garrett unwrapped the bandages. Beneath them, where there should have been an angry, infected gash, was only pink, newly healed skin. A faint scar remained, but it looked weeks old rather than hours. He was feverish this morning, Garrett said, his eyes never leaving his son's leg. The wound was deep enough to see bone. I gave him half the bottle, just a sip really. Within minutes, the fever broke. The wound, it just closed up. Like magic. Kellen looked up at Valen with awe in his eyes. It didn't even hurt, he whispered. It just felt warm, then, better. Word spread through Willow's Rest with the speed of a summer storm. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside Valen's verdant bruise. Farmers with old injuries, mothers with sick children, elderly villagers with chronic pains, they all came, drawn by Garrett's miraculous story and the impossible price. Valen worked steadily through the afternoon, exchanging bottles for copper coins, listening to ailments, offering gentle advice. He never rushed, never raised his voice. When an elderly woman named Marta complained that her arthritis potion seemed to lose potency after a few days, Valen took the bottle back, his eyes focusing on it with sudden intensity. Divine craft deconstruction activated without conscious command. To Valen, it felt like the world sharpening around the edges, details becoming crystalline. He could see the molecular structure of the potion, the way its healing properties were slowly degrading as certain compounds broke down. It was a simple matter of stabilization, rearranging a few bonds here, reinforcing others there. He didn't need additional ingredients, just focus. His hands glowed faintly with a golden light that only he could see, the energy flowing from his consciousness into the bottle. When he handed it back to Marta, the potion shimmered with renewed vigor. It should last longer now, he said simply. Marta took a cautious sip. Her eyes widened as the stiffness in her joints melted away more completely than before. Bless you, she whispered, tears in her eyes. I haven't moved this easily in years. More villagers came. More coins changed hands. More miracles, small and large, occurred in the humble shop. Valen remained oblivious to the economic implications, seeing only the immediate good he was doing. He didn't notice that the traveling alchemist who usually visited Willow's Rest would now find no customers for his overpriced wares. He didn't consider that farmers from neighboring villages might start making the journey to buy his potions instead of purchasing from local suppliers. To him, he was simply helping people at a fair price. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the crowd finally thinned. Valen counted the day's earnings, a modest pile of copper coins, enough to live comfortably in this remote village for weeks. He was sweeping the floor when a shadow fell across the doorway. The village elder stood there, his gnarled hands clasped behind his back. His name was Thorin, and he had led Willow's Rest for 40 years. His face was a map of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and knowing. Valen, Thorin said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. A word, if you please. Valen leaned the broom against the wall and gestured to the chair. Of course, elder. Would you like some tea? I've been brewing a blend of chamomile and mint. Thorin shook his head, his expression grave. Your potions, they work wonders. Young Kellen's leg, old Marta's joints, I've seen it with my own eyes. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But have you considered what this means for the villages around us? Oakhaven's alchemist depends on selling his remedies to our people. The herb gatherers from Pinecrest make their living supplying ingredients to him. Your prices, they're too low, Valen. You're undercutting entire livelihoods. Valen blinked, genuinely surprised. I only charge what's fair. The ingredients are common, the work is simple. He trailed off, seeing the concern in Thorin's eyes. I don't mean to harm anyone. I believe you, Thorin said softly. But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. The world has balances, Valen. Economies, trade routes, supply chains, they're delicate things. What you're doing here? He shook his head again. Just be careful. Not everyone will see your low prices as kindness. Some will see them as a threat. After Thorin left, Valen stood in the gathering twilight, thinking about the elder's words. He had retired to escape politics and power struggles, to find peace in simple work. Yet already, complications were arising. He sighed, locking the shop door and blowing out the candles. Outside, in the deepening shadows between two cottages across the lane, a figure watched. She was dressed in dark traveling clothes, a hood pulled low over her face. In her hands, she clutched a parchment report, its edges crisp and official. The words, "Economic Anomaly Detected," were stamped across the top in bold, black letters. Beneath them, notes detailed the sudden drop in alchemical sales across 3 villages, all tracing back to a single source, Valen's verdant brews. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, studied the shop, memorizing every detail. She had been sent by the kingdom's alchemist guild, dispatched to investigate irregularities in remote regions. What she had found was beyond irregular, it was impossible. Potions of this quality, at these prices, defied every law of alchemical economics she knew. As Valen's window went dark, the figure slipped the report into a leather satchel and melted into the shadows. She would observe for another day, gather more data, then send her findings to the guild. They would want to know about this. They would need to know. In his small living quarters behind the shop, Valen prepared a simple meal of stew and bread, completely unaware that he was being watched. He hummed the same tune as before, his mind already planning tomorrow's brewing. He would need to gather more yarrow, perhaps some willow bark for pain relief. Simple work. Honest work. Outside, the first stars appeared in the violet sky. In the distance, an owl hooted. And in the shadows, the guild investigator began her report, her quill scratching against parchment in the moonlight. The peaceful retirement Valen had sought was already unraveling, thread by invisible thread, and he didn't even know it. The morning sun painted the thatched roof of Valen's verdant brews in warm gold as the retired blacksmith knelt in his small garden behind the shop. His calloused hands, once accustomed to gripping hammers that shaped legendary weapons, now gently plucked common yarrow and dandelion from the soil. To any observer, it was a simple hobby farm, a patch of earth where a weary hero sought quietude. But as Valen's fingers brushed the leaves, a subtle luminescence shimmered through the plants, a divine resonance left by his mere presence. Valen hummed a tuneless melody, his mind blissfully empty of grand schemes. He didn't notice how the soil around his herbs had begun to darken with unnatural richness, nor how the roots seemed to pulse with latent energy. Each wheat he harvested glowed faintly as he placed it in his woven basket, their ordinary forms transformed by the residual power of divine craft deconstruction. To him, they were just ingredients for tomorrow's batch of healing potions, simple, effective, and affordable at 3 copper coins each. Inside the shop, the shelves stood half empty after yesterday's rush. Villagers had returned with stories of miraculous recoveries, and word had spread like wildfire through Willow's Rest. Valen arranged the freshly harvested herbs on his worn wooden counter, his movements methodical. He focused his mind, not on forging swords or armor, but on the subtle alchemical processes that turned common plants into elixirs. A soft golden light emanated from his hands as he worked, the air thickening with the scent of ozone and crushed greenery. Bottles filled with liquid that shimmered like captured sunlight, their potency far beyond anything the local alchemists could produce. Mid-morning brought the creak of the shop door. Thorin, the village elder, entered with a troubled expression that deepened the wrinkles around his eyes. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a tense urgency. Valen, Thorin began, his voice low. We need to talk. The retired blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron, leaving faint smudges of soil. Of course. Is everything all right? More villagers needing potions. That's just it, Thorin said, leaning against the counter. It's not just our village. Riders from Oakhaven and Riverbend arrived at dawn. Their potion markets have collapsed overnight. Alchemists who charged silver for basic remedies can't compete with rumors of your 3 copper miracles. Herb gatherers who supplied them are facing ruin, their entire harvests deemed worthless. Valen blinked, confusion clouding his gentle features. But I'm just selling what people need. At fair prices. Your definition of fair is destroying livelihoods, Thorin pressed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the counter's edge. The trade caravans that passed through yesterday carried tales of panic. Merchants who once profited from potion markups are liquidating stocks at losses. In Riverbend, 2 alchemy shops closed their doors permanently. Families are facing hunger because the local economy relied on that trade. A frown touched Valen's lips. He hadn't considered consequences beyond his shop's walls. In his mind, he'd retired from world saving to simple commerce, a quiet life where his only concern was whether he had enough jars for his brews. Yet here was Thorin, speaking of collapsing markets and hungry families, all because he'd offered healing at a price anyone could afford. Show me, Valen said quietly. He closed his eyes, not to sleep or meditate, but to focus. Divine craft deconstruction activated not with flashy gestures or incantations, but with sheer concentration. His mind expanded beyond the shop's walls, visualizing not weapons or armor, but the intricate web of regional trade routes. He saw them as lines of light connecting villages and towns, flowing with goods and coin. To his enhanced perception, the system appeared flawed, bottlenecks where monopolistic guilds artificially inflated prices, inefficient paths that wasted resources, and imbalances that left some communities thriving while others starved. Hours passed. Valen stood motionless behind his counter, his breathing shallow as he analyzed the economic patterns. Thorin watched, initially impatient, then awed as the air around Valen seemed to vibrate with invisible energy. Dust motes danced in sunbeams that took on crystalline clarity. Finally, Valen's eyes opened. They held a distant, calculating light that Thorin had never seen before, the same focus that had once forged the sword that slew the Demon King. The problem isn't my prices, Valen said, his voice carrying a strange resonance. It's the distribution. The Alchemist Guild controls supply routes through licensing fees and territory restrictions. They create artificial scarcity to maintain high margins. He reached for a piece of parchment and a charcoal stick. With swift, precise strokes, he began drawing, not a map, but a schematic of interconnected nodes and flows. If we establish direct trade between villages, bypassing guild-controlled checkpoints, and if we standardize measurements to prevent shortchanging, and create a rotating market schedule so no single town bears all the transport costs. Thorin stared as the diagram took shape. It was elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. Valen's divine analysis had identified every weakness in the regional economy and proposed solutions that required no rare materials, no magical artifacts, just reorganization based on fairness and efficiency. You realize, Thorin said slowly, that implementing this would undercut the guild's monopoly entirely. They'd lose control over pricing and supply. Valen nodded absently, already mentally adjusting the schematic. But the villagers would get what they need at true fair prices. The herb gatherers could sell directly to multiple markets instead of being forced into exclusive contracts. And the alchemists, well, they'd have to compete on quality rather than manipulation. The rest of the day vanished in a blur of activity that cost Valen his planned afternoon of tending his garden and brewing in peaceful solitude. He met with farmers from Willow's Rest, explaining the new trade routes in simple terms. He helped draft letters to neighboring villages, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for a blacksmith's hands. He even used divine craft deconstruction to analyze a broken cart while belonging to Garrett, improving its structural integrity with nothing but focused intention and common wood, making it capable of carrying heavier loads over the new trade paths. By dusk, the first experimental caravan was being organized. Villagers who had once been skeptical now moved with purpose, their faces alight with hope. Valen watched from his shop doorway, a faint smile touching his lips. He felt the familiar satisfaction of creation, not of weapons, but of systems that helped people. The weariness in his bones seemed to lift slightly. Then hoofbeats echoed down the village's main path. A rider in royal livery approached, his horse lathered from hard travel. The man's face was stern beneath his helmet, his eyes scanning the humble buildings of Willow's Rest with obvious disdain. He reined in before Valen's verdant brews, dismounting with military precision. Valen, proprietor of this establishment, the courier demanded, his voice cutting through the evening quiet. That's me, Valen said, wiping his hands on his apron once more. The courier produced a sealed parchment from his saddlebag. The wax bore the intricate sigil of a crucible over a crown, the emblem of the kingdom's alchemist guild. He thrust it toward Valen with a gesture that brooked no refusal. By order of His Majesty's Royal Alchemist Guild, you are hereby commanded to submit to an immediate audit of your premises, inventory, and business practices, the courier announced, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. Guild investigator Ilara will arrive at dawn tomorrow. Failure to comply will result in seizure of assets and permanent revocation of trade privileges. He turned without waiting for a response, remounted, and spurred his horse back down the path, leaving Valen standing in the gathering twilight with the sealed letter in his hand. The parchment felt heavy, official, and utterly alien to the simple life he'd sought. Inside, the unopened letter seemed to pulse with impending confrontation. Outside, the first stars began to appear above Willow's Rest, their cold light indifferent to the economic tremor spreading from this remote village to kingdoms far beyond. Dawn broke over Willow's Rest with a pale, watery light that did little to warm the chill in the air. Valen stood behind the counter of Valen's verdant brews, wiping a clean cloth over the polished oak surface for the third time that morning. His apron, stained with faint green smudges from yesterday's herb harvesting, hung loosely over his simple linen shirt. Outside, the village stirred to life, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle from Garrett's farm, the scent of baking bread drifting from Marta's cottage. Peaceful. Exactly as he'd hoped. He'd barely finished arranging a new batch of healing potions, their glass bottles catching the morning light with an amber glow, when the shop's bell chimed. Not the cheerful tinkle of a villager's entry, but a sharp, decisive sound that cut through the quiet. Ilara stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the grey morning. She wore the dark blue robes of the kingdom's alchemist guild, embroidered with silver sigils that marked her rank as investigator. Her hair, the color of aged ashwood, was pulled into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the shop with clinical precision, lingering on the hand-painted sign, the rustic shelves, the humble assortment of bottles. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder, bulging with scrolls and alchemical instruments. Valen of Willow's Rest? Her voice was cool, devoid of inflection. That's me, Valen said, offering a warm smile that felt out of place in the sudden tension. Welcome to Valen's verdant brews. Can I help you with something? Ilara stepped inside, her boots clicking on the wooden floorboards. She didn't return the smile. Instead, she produced a sealed parchment from her satchel, the wax seal bearing the guild's crest, a flask entwined with serpents. By order of the kingdom's alchemist guild, I am here to conduct an audit of your establishment. Your unorthodox pricing and reported product efficacy have raised concerns. Valen blinked, his brow furrowing slightly. Concerns? They're just potions. Made from local herbs. So I've heard. Ilara's gaze settled on the nearest shelf, where a row of healing potions stood. She approached, her movements economical and precise. With gloved hands, she selected a bottle, holding it up to the light. The liquid within shimmered with a depth that seemed to swallow the morning glow, swirling with faint golden motes that danced like captured sunlight. Her eyes narrowed. 3 copper coins, is it? Yes. I think that's fair. Fair. The word hung in the air, laden with disbelief. Ilara set the bottle down and withdrew a complex apparatus from her satchel, a multi-lensed scope connected to delicate copper tubing in crystal vials. She placed a single drop of the potion onto a glass slide, then peered through the scope. For a long moment, she was silent, her breath stilling. Valen watched, puzzled, as her knuckles whitened around the instrument's frame. When she finally looked up, her face had paled. This is impossible. Is something wrong? Valen asked, genuine concern in his voice. I can make another batch if that one's off. Sometimes the weeds by the south path have a slightly different. Off? Ilara cut him off, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. This potion has a purity rating of 99.7%. The molecular alignment is perfect. The mana resonance is stabilized at a level I've only seen in artifacts from the Age of Legends. She stared at him, her stern mask cracking to reveal raw astonishment. Do you understand what you've created? This is god-tier alchemy. The guild's master alchemists would kill for a formula like this. And you're selling it for 3 copper coins. Valen scratched his head, his confusion deepening. It's just a healing potion. I focus on the herbs, analyze their properties, and, well, they come out like that. It's not complicated. Not complicated. Ilara repeated the words as if they were in a foreign tongue. She took a steadying breath, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. Show me your process. Valen shrugged and led her to the back room, where a simple workbench held mortar and pestle, a few ceramic bowls, and bundles of common herbs, dandelion, plantain, yarrow, gathered from the roadside that morning. Ilara's eyes scanned the setup, her disbelief morphing into something akin to horror. This is it. No alembics. No mana-infused crucibles. Not even a basic purification array. I don't need them, Valen said mildly. He picked up a handful of yarrow, its leaves still damp with dew. Watch. He closed his eyes, not in dramatic flourish, but in simple focus. Divine craft deconstruction activated, a subtle shift in the air, a pressure that made the light seem to bend around his hands. To Ilara, it felt like standing too close to a forge at the moment of creation, heatless but profound. Valen's mind analyzed the herb, not just its physical properties, but its essence, its potential. He saw the pathways where healing energy could flow, the weak points where impurities gathered, the latent divinity that all things held if one knew how to look. Without adding a single rare ingredient, he focused, and the yarrow in his hands began to glow with a soft, white light. When he opened his eyes and crushed it into a bowl, the paste shimmered with the same golden motes as the finished potion. Ilara stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her chest. What are you? Just a retired blacksmith, Valen said, wiping his hands on his apron. He noticed the strain then, a faint throbbing behind his temples, a weariness in his limbs. Using divine craft deconstruction always drained him, a cost he'd learned to accept. Would you like some tea? You look pale. Instead of answering, Ilara thrust her alchemical scope toward him. Analyze this. Valen took the instrument, turning it over in his hands. It was beautifully made, with intricate engravings and finely ground lenses, but as he focused his ability, flaws leaped out at him, microfractures in the crystal that scattered mana readings, a misalignment in the copper tubing that caused a 15% loss in accuracy, an unnecessary complexity in the sigil array that introduced harmonic interference. He pointed to each issue as he spoke, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. Here, the lens grind is off by half a degree, it distorts high-frequency mana signatures. And this tubing junction, see how it kinks? That creates a bottleneck. If you rerouted it along this path instead, you'd get cleaner readings. Oh, and this sigil here, it's redundant. The third glyph cancels out the fifth. You could remove both and add a simple stabilization rune here, near the base. Ilara listened, her initial shock hardening into something colder, more calculating. She took back the scope, her fingers tracing the flaws he'd identified. You diagnosed this in seconds. Without disassembly. Without even activating the mana flow. It's just how I see things, Valen said, rubbing his temples. The mental effort was starting to fog his thoughts. Is that helpful? Helpful. Ilara's laugh was short, brittle. You've just rendered 10,000 gold worth of guild standard equipment obsolete with a glance. She paced the small room, her robes swirling. Do you realize what this means? Your potions are destabilizing local economies. Your analysis could upend entire fields of study. You're not just a shopkeeper, you're a cataclysm in an apron. Valen's shoulders slumped. I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to run my shop, help the villagers. Thorin said something about economies, but I thought if we traded fairly. Fairly. Ilara stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto his. There was no malice in her gaze, only a grim certainty. There is nothing fair about this. You operate outside every system, every balance. The guild, they won't understand. They'll see only a threat. She moved to the shop's front window, where the morning sun now cast long shadows across the village lane. From her satchel, she withdrew a small, crystalline orb, a messaging artifact, humming with stored mana. Her fingers danced over its surface, inputting a coded sequence. The orb glowed, and she spoke into it, her voice low and urgent, carrying across whatever vast distance connected her to the guild's headquarters. Investigator Ilara reporting. Audit complete. Subject, Valen of Willow's Rest, proprietor of Valen's Verdant Brews. Findings, potions verified as god-tier quality, produced from mundane materials via unknown methodology. Subject possesses analytical capabilities that deconstruct and improve advanced alchemical tools instantaneously. Economic impact assessment, catastrophic. Local markets already collapsing, potential for global destabilization if methodology spreads. Recommendation, immediate containment. Threat level, catastrophic. Send enforcers. The orb's glow faded, leaving the shop in sudden silence. Ilara turned to face Valen, her expression unreadable. Outside, the village continued its peaceful morning, utterly unaware of the storm that had just been summoned. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Valen's verdant brews, casting warm rectangles of light across the wooden counter where bottles of emerald and amber potions glowed with inner vitality. Valen hummed a tuneless melody as he wiped down the shelves with a faded cloth, his apron stained with herb residue from the morning's brewing session. The scent of crushed mint and chamomile hung in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of the roadside weeds he'd gathered at dawn. Outside, the village of Willow's Rest stirred to life, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, children's laughter from the square, the creak of a farmer's cart laden with early harvest. Valen paused, his hand hovering over a bottle of healing potion. He'd noticed something peculiar about the yarrow he'd collected yesterday. The leaves seemed to shimmer with a faint golden sheen under certain light, a side effect of his divine craft deconstruction that he still didn't fully understand. With a sigh, he pushed the thought aside. Today was for simple tasks, restocking the arthritis remedies Marta had requested, perhaps brewing a batch of anti-fever tonics before the autumn chill set in. He reached for a bundle of dried willow bark, his fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the workbench worn smooth by decades of crafting. Then the door exploded inward. Splinters of oak flew across the room as two figures burst through the entrance, their silhouettes blocking the sunlight. Valen stumbled back, dropping the willow bark as his eyes adjusted to the sudden gloom. The men stood framed in the shattered doorway, their presence sucking the warmth from the cozy shop. They wore polished steel plate armor etched with intricate runes that pulsed with a cold, blue light, the official insignia of the kingdom's alchemist guild, a stylized alembic crossed with a sword. The taller enforcer carried a massive warhammer slung across his back, its head crackling with restrained magical energy. The shorter one held a spiked mace in a gauntlet fist, his eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. Valen, proprietor of this establishment, the taller enforcer barked, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't wait for an answer. By order of the Royal Alchemist Guild, you are to cease all operations immediately. Your shop represents an economic destabilization event of catastrophic magnitude. The shorter enforcer stepped forward, his boots crunching on broken wood. Surrender your inventory for confiscation. Your brewing equipment will be dismantled. Resist, and we have authorization to reduce this building to rubble. He gestured with his mace toward the shelves of potions. These aberrations cannot be allowed to circulate. Valen blinked, his mind struggling to process the violence of their entrance. He glanced at the shattered door, then at the enforcer's armor, his gaze lingering on the glowing runes. Something about the magical circuitry seemed inefficient. A faint shimmer of divine insight flickered at the edge of his perception, his divine craft deconstruction stirring awake, drawn to the complexity of the enchanted plate. I'm sorry about the door, Valen said, his voice calm as he straightened his apron. It was hand-carved by old man Heston down the lane. Took him 3 weeks. The taller enforcer's helmet tilted slightly. You're not taking this seriously, peasant. Oh, I am, Valen replied, stepping around the counter. He moved with the deliberate pace of a craftsman examining raw materials. It's just that, well, your armor. Both enforcers stiffened, their weapons rising defensively. What about our armor? The shorter one growled. Valen circled them slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused. The world seemed to sharpen, the dust motes in the air became crystalline, the faint hum of the armor's enchantments resolved into distinct harmonic frequencies. His divine craft deconstruction activated without conscious effort, analyzing the steel plate layer by layer, tracing the flow of magical energy through the runic channels. See here, Valen said, pointing to the taller enforcer's pauldron. The enchantment matrix has a feedback loop in the left shoulder joint. Every time you raise your arm above horizontal, it creates a harmonic resonance that weakens the structural integrity by. He squinted, calculating. About 12%. Over time, that'll cause microfractures. He moved to the shorter enforcer, tapping his own chin thoughtfully. And your greaves, the mana conduits are misaligned with the kinetic dampening runes. That's why you're favoring your right leg, isn't it? The enchantment is leaching heat from your muscles. Must feel like walking through snow after an hour. The enforcers exchanged glances behind their visors. The shorter one's grip on his mace tightened until the leather of his glove creaked. How do you know that? The taller enforcer demanded, his warhammer now held at ready position. Valen shrugged. It's just obvious if you look closely. The craftsmanship is good, excellent steel quality, precise rune engraving, but the design principles are flawed. He gestured toward their weapons. May I? Before they could react, Valen reached out and placed a hand on the taller enforcer's warhammer. His fingers traced the runes along the haft, his eyes losing focus as divine craft deconstruction flooded his senses. He saw it all, the hammer's creation in a guild forge, the alchemist's imperfect understanding of impact distribution, the wasted magical energy bleeding off as harmless light instead of reinforcing the striking surface. Fascinating, Valen murmured. You're only utilizing 38% of the enchantment's potential. The rest is decorative. The taller enforcer yanked the hammer back. Enough of this. You have until the count of 3 to. Let me fix it, Valen interrupted, his voice suddenly earnest. Free of charge. I hate seeing good craftsmanship hampered by simple oversights. For a long moment, the shop was silent except for the distant sounds of the village. The enforcers stood frozen, their training warring with sheer bewilderment. This wasn't in any guild protocol, a suspected economic terrorist offering to improve their gear. The shorter enforcer lowered his mace slightly. Fix it? With what? You're a potion brewer. Principles the same, Valen said, already moving to his workbench. He gathered a handful of common materials, a pinch of iron filings from a rusted hinge he'd been meaning to replace, a few drops of lamp oil, some crushed quartz from the path outside. To anyone else, it would look like junk. To Valen's divine perception, each item contained latent potential waiting to be unlocked. He placed the materials on the counter and closed his eyes. Focus. That was the key, not rare components, but perfect understanding. His divine craft deconstruction activated fully, the world dissolving into streams of data, molecular structures, magical resonance patterns, stress points, energy flows. A headache began to build behind his temples, the familiar cost of pushing his ability. Bring the armor here, Valen said, his voice distant as he maintained concentration. Hesitantly, the enforcers approached. The taller one removed his gauntlets, then his chest plate, the heavy steel clanking on the wooden counter. Up close, Valen could see the imperfections clearly, tiny cracks in the enchantment channels, misaligned runic sigils, inefficient mana distribution nodes. He placed his hands on the chest plate. No forge fire, no anvil, no magical incantations. Just focus. The iron filings shimmered and dissolved into a fine mist that settled onto the steel. The lamp oil spread across the surface in impossible geometric patterns. The crushed quartz melted into the metal without heat, reinforcing weak points at the molecular level. Valen's breathing grew labored. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he redirected the armor's enchantment flows, repairing flawed circuits, optimizing energy pathways. The blue runes flared brightly, then settled into a deeper, steadier azure glow. The steel itself seemed to drink the light, becoming darker and more substantial. Try it, Valen gasped, leaning heavily on the counter. The mental drain was significant, he'd used up most of his daily capacity for divine craft deconstruction. The taller enforcer donned the chest plate. His eyes widened behind his visor. It's lighter. But stronger. The enchantment isn't straining against my movements anymore. He flexed his arms experimentally. The feedback loop is gone. Now the greaves, Valen said, already reaching for the shorter enforcer's leg armor. One by one, he improved their gear. The Warhammer's enchantment was recalibrated to channel 94% of its magical energy into impact force. The mace's spikes were realigned to create harmonic vibrations that would shatter bone without excessive force. Every piece of armor was optimized, weaknesses eliminated, efficiencies maximized. When he finished, Valen slumped onto a stool, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. The shop seemed to swim around him. There. Should last you years without maintenance. The enforcers stood in the center of the room, their transformed gear glowing with steady, powerful light. The taller one tested his warhammer's weight, swinging it in a slow arc. The weapon hummed with contained energy, the air crackling around it. This is impossible, the shorter enforcer whispered, staring at his reforged greaves. Guild-master alchemists spend months on single enchantments. You did this in minutes with junk. Valen managed a weak smile. It's not about the materials. It's about understanding what they can become. For a long minute, neither enforcer moved. Their mission parameters conflicted violently with reality. They'd been sent to dismantle a threat, but the threat had just given them gear superior to anything their guild could produce. The taller enforcer's hand went to the communication crystal at his belt, then hesitated. We should report this, the shorter enforcer said, his voice uncertain. Report what? The taller one replied quietly. That we failed our mission because a retired potion brewer outcrafted the entire guild. They looked at each other, then at Valen, who was now sipping water from a clay cup, his hands still shaking slightly from the exertion. Our orders were to shut you down, the taller enforcer said at last. But these improvements, they're guild secrets now. If we destroy you, that knowledge dies. Valen nodded slowly. Knowledge should be shared. That's why I sell my potions cheap. The enforcers gathered their transformed gear in silence. At the shattered doorway, the taller one paused, looking back at the humble shop with its glowing potions and herb-stained workbench. They'll send others, he warned. Stronger. Less reasonable. I'll be here, Valen said simply. The enforcers disappeared into the village square, their newly indestructible armor catching the sunlight. Valen watched them go, then sighed as he surveyed the damage. The door would need replacing. He'd have to ask old man Heston for another, maybe offer some of that arthritis potion Marta liked as payment. He was kneeling to gather splinters of wood when the first tremor hit. The ground shuddered, making the potion bottles rattle on their shelves. A deep, resonant roar echoed across the valley, not animal, not human, but something ancient and vast. It shook the very timbers of the shop, vibrating in Valen's bones. Windows rattled in their frames throughout Willow's Rest. Outside, villagers froze in the streets, looking skyward with dawning terror. The roar came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of trees snapping like twigs in the distant forest. A shadow passed over the sun, massive and winged. Valen stood slowly, wood fragments forgotten in his hand. He peered through the shattered doorway at the suddenly darkening sky. The cozy warmth of his shop felt fragile now, like a candle flame in a gathering storm. Somewhere beyond the hills, something old and hungry had awakened. The dragon's roar that had shaken the valley still echoed in Valen's bones as he surveyed the splintered remains of his shop door. Morning light filtered through the cracks, casting jagged shadows across the floor where the guild enforcers had stood just hours before. His head throbbed with the lingering fatigue from using divine craft deconstruction on their equipment, a deep, hollow ache behind his eyes that reminded him he wasn't as young as he'd been when forging the sword that slew the Demon King. He was sweeping up wood fragments when the air changed. First came the smell, ozone and ancient stone, like a mountain cracking open after a lightning strike. Then the temperature dropped so suddenly Valen could see his breath fogging in the suddenly chill air. Outside, villagers' shouts turned to screams that were abruptly cut off by a pressure that made ears pop and knees buckle. Valen stepped through the ruined doorway, broom still in hand. The dragon filled the village square. Not the winged monstrosities of legend that blotted out the sun, but something more terrible in its precision. It stood no taller than 2 men, but every scale, each the size of a dinner plate and the color of tarnished gold, seemed to drink the morning light rather than reflect it. Its wings were folded tight against its back like folded steel blades, and its eyes burned with the cold fire of molten brass. When it breathed, steam curled from nostrils wide enough to fit a man's head. Valen of the verdant bruise, the dragon said, and its voice was the sound of coins cascading down a stone chute. The Dragon King's treasury has noted your disruptions. Valen blinked, setting his broom against the doorframe. My shop's just over there. Would you like to come inside? I've got some mint tea brewing. The dragon's head tilted, a movement so smooth it seemed mechanical. I am Sithrax, envoy of the Golden Horde. I do not drink tea. I collect tribute. Oh. Valen wiped his hands on his apron. The fabric was stained with crushed herbs and a smudge of lamp oil from repairing the enforcer's armor. I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of treasure. Just potions, really. Healing drafts, stamina tonics, good for sore wings, if you've been flying long distances. Sithrax took a step forward, and the cobblestones cracked beneath clawed feet. Each talon was longer than Valen's forearm and sharper than any blade he'd ever forged. Your potions, the dragon said, have created ripples in the economy of value. Peasants trade your healing drafts instead of gold. Adventurers sell their loot to buy your tonics instead of depositing coin in guild vaults. The Dragon King's hoard, carefully balanced across centuries, now fluctuates with the harvest of your roadside weeds. Valen frowned. But they're just potions. They are perfect things, Sithrax hissed, steam jetting from its nostrils. And perfection has a weight in the economy of dragons. For every god-tier potion you sell at peasant prices, a gemstone in the Dragon King's vault loses its luster. For every miraculous draft that costs less than a loaf of bread, a bar of gold becomes merely metal. The dragon leaned closer, and Valen could see his own reflection in the polished scales, a middle-aged man in a stained apron, looking more confused than afraid. You will provide tribute, Sithrax declared. 3 artifacts of legendary quality. Forged by your hands, from materials I will provide. They must radiate such value that they restore balance to the horde. Materials you'll provide? Valen asked. Sithrax gestured with a wingtip, and 3 objects clattered to the cobblestones, a river stone worn smooth by centuries of water, a piece of driftwood bleached bone-white by sun and salt, and a chunk of common quartz no larger than Valen's fist. From these, the dragon said, create treasures worthy of a dragon's hoard. Valen picked up the river stone first. It fit neatly in his palm, cool and smooth. He closed his eyes and reached for divine craft deconstruction. The world narrowed to the stone's essence. He saw not just its physical form, the layers of sediment compressed over millennia, the flecks of mica that caught the light, but its potential. In his mind's eye, the stone unfolded like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing pathways of crystalline structure that could be realigned, impurities that could be refined into virtues. He saw how pressure could be applied not with hammer and anvil, but with focused will, compressing carbon into diamond-bright facets. He saw how light could be trapped and amplified, not with enchantments, but with perfect geometric alignment. It drained him. The fatigue from earlier became a yawning emptiness in his mind, a hollow ache that spread through his temples and down his spine. His knees trembled, and he had to lean against the shop's wall for support. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill dragon breath air. When he opened his eyes, the river stone glowed with inner fire. It had transformed into a gem the size of a chicken egg, cut with facets so precise they seemed to fracture reality around them. It wasn't just beautiful, it radiated value. Looking at it made the mind calculate impossible wealth, made the heart yearn for possession. It shone with a light that had nothing to do with reflection and everything to do with perceived worth. Sithrax made a sound deep in its throat, the dragon equivalent of a gasp. Valen didn't pause. He picked up the driftwood next. This time the process was harder. His vision swam as he focused, the edges of reality going soft and blurry. He saw the wood's history, the tree it came from, the years of growth, the river that carried it, the sun that bleached it. He saw how cellulose fibers could be realigned into something stronger than steel, how lignin could be transmuted into a substance that resonated with magical potential. He worked not with tools but with understanding, unraveling the wood's nature and reweaving it into something new. When he finished, the driftwood had become a scepter. It was simple in design, just a straight shaft with a modest pommel, but its simplicity was its perfection. Every curve followed natural golden ratios. The grain of the wood, now dark as ebony, flowed in patterns that seemed to tell stories of ancient forests and forgotten kings. Holding it, one would feel authority. Owning it, one would feel destined to rule. Valen's breath came in ragged gasps. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He reached for the quartz last, his hand trembling. Enough, Sithrax said, but the word lacked its earlier certainty. Valen shook his head. You asked for 3. He took the quartz in both hands, and this time he didn't just use divine craft deconstruction, he poured what remained of his strength into it. The fatigue became pain, sharp and bright behind his eyes. He felt something in his mind stretch thin, like leather worked too hard. But he saw the quartz as truth, silicon and oxygen in perfect lattice, waiting to be awakened. He didn't make it beautiful. He made it true. The quartz became a lens, perfectly clear, perfectly shaped. Looking through it didn't magnify or distort, it revealed the value of things, the essence of worth, the hidden potential in ordinary objects. It was a tool for seeing what dragons spent lifetimes hoarding, not just treasure, but meaning. Valen dropped to one knee, the lens clutched in his hand. The world swam around him. He could hear his own heartbeat too loud in his ears, feel the cold sweat soaking through his shirt beneath the apron. Sithrax stared at the 3 artifacts lying on the cobblestones. The gem that radiated wealth. The scepter that commanded authority. The lens that revealed truth. These. The dragon began, then stopped. Its brass-fire eyes studied Valen, really studied him, for the first time. Not as a threat or a resource, but as a being. You made these from stone, wood, and common crystal. You provided the materials, Valen said weakly. He tried to stand, failed, and settled for sitting on the ground. The cool cobblestones felt good against his overheated skin. But the value. Sithrax reached out a taloned foot, hesitated, then gently, with surprising delicacy for such a large creature, picked up the gem. This contains more worth than a mountain of gold. Not because of magic, but because of perfection. The dragon looked from the gem to Valen, then to the humble potion shop with its broken door and simple sign. The Dragon King's treasury will accept this tribute, Sithrak said at last. The words were formal, but the tone had changed. The steam from its nostrils was warmer now, less aggressive. Balance is restored. More than restored. It gathered the 3 artifacts carefully, tucking them against its chest where scales formed a natural pouch. Then it did something Valen didn't expect, it bowed. Just a slight dip of the head, but a bow nonetheless. Your shop may continue, Sithrak said. The dragons will watch. But we will not interfere. With a beat of wings that kicked up dust and sent villagers' laundry fluttering on lines, the dragon envoy launched into the sky. It climbed swiftly, becoming a dark shape against the morning sun, then vanished into the clouds. Valen sat on the cobblestones for a long time, waiting for the strength to return to his legs. The mental exhaustion was deeper than anything he'd felt since retiring, a hollowed-out feeling that made thought difficult. He'd used too much of divine craft deconstruction in too short a time, and now he paid the price. Eventually, he managed to stand. The village was beginning to stir again, doors cracking open, faces peering out with a mixture of fear and awe. Old Marta hobbled over from her cottage, her arthritis forgotten for the moment. Valen, she said, her voice hushed. A dragon. Here. Just delivering materials, Valen said vaguely. He leaned against his shop's wall, breathing slowly. I think I need to sit down. He didn't get the chance. Garrett came running from the north road, his face pale beneath his farmer's tan. He skidded to a stop, breathing hard, and thrust a crumpled piece of paper at Valen. Ryder came through, Garrett gasped. From Oakhaven. Didn't even stop, just threw these and kept going. Valen smoothed the paper. The printing was crude, done with a stamp and cheap ink, but the words were clear enough. The Adventurers Union mobilizes. Economic Liberation Army forms. March on the source of disruption. All guilds stand aside. Below, in smaller print, the so-called potion shop in Willow's Rest has destabilized markets, destroyed livelihoods, and threatened the very foundation of adventuring. We will liberate the economy by removing the cause. Justice will be served with steel and spell. Valen stared at the notice. Then he looked at his shop, the broken door, the simple sign, the humble building that was supposed to be his peaceful retirement. An army, he said quietly. Garrett nodded, his face grim. They're gathering at Riverbend. Hundreds, the rider said. Maybe thousands. Adventurers, mercenaries, anyone who's lost coin because of, well. He gestured vaguely at the shop. In the distance, a bell began to toll, not the gentle chime of the village chapel, but the harsh, urgent clang of a warning bell from Oakhaven's watchtower. Other bells answered, a spreading cacophony of alarm from town to town. Valen looked at the notice again. Then he looked at the empty space in his storage room where his stock of common herbs had been, the yarrow, the mint, the chamomile he'd used for potions and, just now, as the conceptual fuel for crafting dragon tribute. He was out of materials. He was exhausted. And an army was marching. Somewhere to the south, the first banners of the Economic Liberation Army caught the morning sun, and the road to Willow's Rest began to darken with marching feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow's Rest, but the usual tranquility had been shattered. Valen was sweeping the front step of his potion shop, the scent of crushed herbs still lingering from yesterday's work, when the first shouts echoed down the dirt road. He looked up, squinting against the light, to see a ragged band of figures marching toward his shop. They were adventurers, 20 or more, clad in mismatched armor and bearing weapons that showed signs of hard use. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, his chainmail rusted at the edges. He carried a notched greatsword that seemed too heavy for his weary stance. Behind him, others followed, a woman with a chipped shield, a young archer with frayed bowstrings, a mage whose robes were patched with crude stitches. Their faces were etched with desperation, not malice. Valen, the leader bellowed, his voice raw. You in there, potion peddler. Valen set his broom aside, wiping his hands on his apron. I am. Can I help you? The adventurers fanned out, surrounding the shop's entrance. Villagers peeked from windows and doorways, their expressions fearful. Garrett stood by his farm cart, clutching a pitchfork, while Thorin the elder watched from the shade of the old oak tree, his face grim. Help us, the leader spat. You've ruined us. I'm Rorik, leader of the Copper Fong Company. We used to make a decent living clearing goblin nests and escorting caravans. But since your shop opened, no one buys our gear anymore. Why pay 50 gold for a healing potion when yours costs 5 silver? Why commission a new sword when you can get one of your miracles for pennies? Valen blinked, his brow furrowing. I only wanted to make things affordable. The herbs grow by the roadside, it seemed fair. Fair. Rorik's laugh was bitter. Our blacksmith in Riverbend closed his forge last week. The alchemist's apprentice left town because he couldn't compete. Our entire economy is collapsing, and you sit here in your cozy shop, oblivious. He hefted his great sword. We're here to shut you down. Permanently. The other adventurers shifted, their weapons glinting in the sun. The archer knocked an arrow, her hands trembling. The mage muttered a spell, a faint glow gathering at her fingertips. Valen felt a pang of genuine confusion. He'd never intended harm, only to help his neighbors. But as he looked at Rorik's worn armor, at the fatigue in the adventurer's eyes, something clicked. This wasn't about malice, it was about survival. His divine craft deconstruction stirred, an instinctive urge to analyze, to understand. Wait, Valen said, raising a hand. Let me see your gear. Rorik hesitated, then thrust his great sword forward. What, going to mock it too? Valen took the weapon, his fingers tracing the notches along the blade. He closed his eyes, focusing. Divine craft deconstruction activated, a subtle hum in his mind. Instantly, he saw the sword's history, poorly tempered steel, rushed craftsmanship, repairs made with inferior materials. But he also saw its potential, the latent strength waiting to be unlocked. This was made in haste, Valen murmured, his eyes still closed. The smith used low-grade ore and didn't quench it properly. But the core is sound. He opened his eyes, looking at Rorik. You need better weapons, yes? Not to destroy my shop, but to do your jobs. Rorik scowled. We can't afford better. Not anymore. Valen nodded slowly. He turned to Garrett. Bring me your old farm tools. The broken ones. Garrett stared, then hurried to his cart, returning with a rusted scythe, a cracked hoe, and a bent plowshare. Valen laid them on the ground before his shop. The adventurers watched, skepticism warring with curiosity. What's this? Rorik demanded. A demonstration, Valen said softly. He knelt, placing his hands on the scythe. Divine craft deconstruction flared to life, a brilliant golden light enveloping the tool. Valen's breath caught as he focused, channeling his divine ability. He didn't just see the rust and cracks, he saw the molecular structure, the flaws in the iron, the way stress had weakened the metal. With a thought, he began reshaping it. The scythe glowed white-hot, then cooled in seconds, transforming into a sleek, double-edged longsword. The metal gleamed with an inner light, the edge so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself. Valen picked it up, his hands shaking slightly. The mental drain was immediate, a deep, aching fatigue that settled behind his eyes. Perfecting this required more than casual focus, it demanded a piece of his very essence. Try it, Valen said, handing the sword to Rorik. Rorik took it, his eyes widening. The sword was lighter than his great sword, perfectly balanced. He swung it experimentally, and the blade sang through the air, leaving a faint trail of light. He brought it down on a nearby stone, the rock split cleanly in two, the sword unharmed. By the gods, Rorik whispered. This feels like a legendary blade. But it was just a scythe. Valen was already working on the hoe, his concentration absolute. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he deconstructed the tool, analyzing every flaw. He reshaped it into a tower shield, the metal reforging itself into layered plates that interlocked with divine precision. The process drained him further, he felt as if he were pouring weeks of peaceful rest into the creation. Each perfect item cost him not just energy, but time, the quiet hours of sleep he cherished. The woman with the chipped shield took the new one, her jaw dropping. It's lighter than my old one, but I can feel the strength. Like nothing could pierce it. Valen moved to the plowshare, his vision blurring at the edges. He pushed through, using divine craft deconstruction to transform it into a set of 10 arrows. Each shaft was straight and true, the arrowhead sharp enough to pierce dragon scale. The archer tested one, firing it at a distant tree, the arrow embedded itself deep into the trunk, vibrating with residual energy. How? Rorik asked, his voice hushed. How can you do this? Valen swayed on his feet, bracing himself against the shop's wall. I see what things can be, he said, his voice tired. But it costs me. Each of these. I've sacrificed days of rest to make them perfect. I can't mass-produce them. But I can help you. He looked at the adventurers, his expression earnest. You don't need to destroy my shop. You need gear that lets you work safely. Take these. Use them. And if you bring me broken equipment, I'll fix it, not for profit, but because it's right. The adventurers exchanged glances. The anger had faded from their faces, replaced by awe and dawning hope. Rorik lowered his great sword, then knelt, placing the new longsword on the ground before Valen. We came here to fight you, Rorik said, his voice thick. But you've given us more than we ever had. The Copper Fawn Company stands with you, Valen. We'll defend this village. The other adventurers followed suit, kneeling or bowing. A murmur of relief swept through the villagers. Garrett grinned, lowering his pitchfork. Thorin nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. But in the crowd, a figure moved differently. He was a lean man in nondescript leather armor, his face obscured by a hood. He had slipped in with the adventurers, unnoticed in the chaos. As the others focused on Valen, he edged forward, his movements fluid and silent. A dagger gleamed in his hand, its blade coated with a viscous, dark liquid, alchemical poison, guild-made. Valen was still catching his breath, the exhaustion from the divine crafting weighing on him. He smiled weakly at Rorik, accepting the adventurer's hand to help him stand. The villagers began to cheer, clustering around the new weapons, their fear turning to celebration. The hooded man saw his opening. He darted through the crowd, a shadow among the light. His blade aimed true, for the space between Valen's shoulder blades, where a single strike could pierce heart or spine. He was 10 paces away, then 5, then 2. Rorik turned, his eyes widening. Valen, behind. But the warning came too late. The assassin lunged, dagger flashing in the sun. And Valen, drained and weary, did not yet see the death coming for him. The morning sun warmed Valen's back as he knelt in the small garden behind his shop, fingers working through the soil with the gentle care of a lifelong craftsman. Dew still clung to the leaves of the common herbs he cultivated, thyme, mint, and chamomile, their scents mingling with the earthy aroma of turned earth. His apron was smudged with dirt, and his mind, though weary from the previous day's exertions, found solace in this simple task. The village of Willow's Rest had settled into an uneasy quiet after Rorik and his Copper Fawn Company had pledged their protection, but Valen preferred the rhythm of weeding and watering to the tension of armed guards. He was examining a patch of mint for signs of blight when the air shifted. Not with sound, but with absence, the birdsong from the nearby oak tree ceased mid-trill. Valen's hands stilled, his senses honed by centuries of battlefield awareness prickling. Before he could rise, shadow detached itself from the deeper shade of his shop's rear wall. The assassin moved with liquid silence, a blur of dark leather and dull metal. Valen caught the glint of twin daggers, their edges smeared with something viscous and greenish-black, as they arced toward his throat and side. There was no warning shout, no theatrical proclamation. Only lethal intent. Valen threw himself sideways, dirt spraying as he rolled. One blade grazed his shoulder, slicing through apron and tunic to draw a thin line of blood. Fire bloomed along the cut, immediate and unnatural. Poison. He could feel it spreading, a cold numbness chasing the burn, his muscles already beginning to stiffen. The assassin, a figure of average height wrapped in nondescript grays and browns, face obscured by a cloth mask, didn't pause. They flowed forward, daggers weaving a net of death. Valen scrambled backward, his movements growing sluggish as the poison worked. He bumped against the stone well at the garden's edge, trapped. Divine craft deconstruction, he thought, the ability rising unbidden. His vision sharpened, the world dissolving into lines of essence and structure. The poison in his bloodstream became a schematic of interacting compounds, a paralytic derived from nightshade berries, enhanced with magebane extract to resist magical healing. The daggers themselves were mundane steel, but their coatings were alchemical masterworks, designed to kill within minutes. Valen's mind, already drained from crafting artifacts for the dragon envoy and god-tier weapons for the adventurers, screamed in protest. Using his divine ability now was like trying to lift a mountain with bare hands. But he had no choice. As the assassin lunged again, Valen focused. Not on the blades, but on the herbs at his feet. His perception expanded, analyzing the mint's cooling properties, the thyme's antiseptic oils, the chamomile's calming essence. With a wrenching effort of will, he invoked divine craft deconstruction upon his own body and the plant simultaneously. The world blurred. Valen's hands moved without conscious thought, snatching handfuls of mint and thyme. He crushed them between his palms, feeling their juices mix with his blood. His divine ability rewrote the interaction. The mint's menthol bonded with the nightshade compounds, neutralizing them. The thyme's oils catalyzed a reaction that broke down the magebane extract. It wasn't elegant. It was desperate, brute force alchemy performed mid-combat, and it burned through his mental reserves like a wildfire. He gasped, sweat beading on his forehead as the numbness receded from his limbs. The assassin hesitated, seeing their target shake off a poison that should have felled a bull. In that moment, Valen shoved away from the well and stumbled toward his shop's back door. The assassin recovered quickly, daggers flashing. One buried itself in the doorframe beside Valen's head as he wrenched the door open. He stumbled inside, into the cozy clutter of his brewing room, shelves of bottled potions, drying herbs hanging from rafters, a small hearth with a simmering cauldron. The assassin followed, silent as a ghost. Valen backed against his workbench, hands scrambling for anything useful. He found a mortar and pestle, a bundle of dried chamomile, a jar of honey. The assassin advanced, confident now. They could see the exhaustion in Valen's eyes, the tremor in his hands. "No more tricks, Blacksmith," the assassin whispered, voice raspy and genderless. "The guild sends its regards." Valen didn't answer. He focused again, divine craft deconstruction flaring. He analyzed the remaining poison in his system, traces still circulating, and the ingredients before him. Honey's binding properties, chamomile's purifying essence, the residual magic in the mortar from countless potions ground. His mind, pushed past its limits, felt like it was cracking. But he combined them anyway, crushing chamomile into honey in the mortar, infusing the mixture with a final surge of divine focus. The result was a thick, golden paste. Valen smeared it over the wound on his shoulder. Heat spread, then cool relief as the last vestiges of poison were purged. The assassin watched, eyes narrowing behind the mask. "Impossible," they muttered. "Common materials," Valen breathed, leaning heavily on the bench. "Properly understood." The assassin attacked again, but slower now, perhaps wary of further divine interventions. Valen dodged a dagger thrust, grabbing a copper stirring rod from the bench. It was a simple tool, worn smooth from use. As the assassin's other blade came for his chest, Valen invoked divine craft deconstruction one more time, not to craft, but to analyze. He saw the dagger's path, the micro-tremors in the assassin's wrist, the weak point in their stance. He didn't strike to kill. He struck to disarm, tapping the rod against the assassin's wrist with precise force. The dagger clattered to the floor. The assassin recoiled, clutching their hand. For a long moment, they faced each other in the quiet shop. Valen's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind a hollowed-out shell. The assassin's remaining dagger wavered. "Why haven't you killed me?" the assassin asked, genuine confusion in their tone. "I'm retired," Valen said simply. "I just want to run my shop." The assassin barked a short, humorless laugh. "Then you're a fool. Do you think this is just about the Alchemist Guild?" They reached into their tunic with their uninjured hand and pulled out a rolled parchment, tossing it at Valen's feet. "Look. See what you've truly stirred up." Valen knelt, every movement an effort, and unrolled the parchment. It was a contract, written in elegant, formal script. At the top, a title, Pact of Economic Restoration. Below, a list of signatories that made his blood run cold. The Kingdom's Alchemist Guild. The Adventurers' Union. The Dragon King's Treasury. And 3 human kingdoms he recognized, Erelon, Karthus, and Viridia, their royal seals stamped in wax of gold, crimson, and deep blue. The terms were stark: elimination of Valen's verdant brews and all associated economic disruptions, by any means necessary. The contract was dated just days ago, signed in urgent succession as the global crisis deepened. Valen stared at the names, the official seals. The Dragon King's treasury had promised no further interference after accepting tribute, yet here they were, signing a pact to destroy him. The Adventurers' Union was already marching an army, but this made it official, coordinated. And the kingdoms, entire nations now viewing his humble shop as a threat to their stability. "They're united," the assassin said, watching his reaction. "You've collapsed markets from here to the capital. Dragon hordes are losing value. Adventurers can't sell loot. Kingdoms are facing rebellions over price crashes. And you're just a man in a garden. Valen looked up, the parchment trembling in his hand. For the first time, the scale of it all truly struck him. This wasn't about a few angry guild enforcers or a dragon's tribute demand. He had, with his simple potions and fair prices, unraveled the fabric of the world's economy. And now the world was coming to stitch itself back together, with him as the loose thread to be clipped. The assassin took a step back, toward the door. I've delivered the message. My contract is complete. They'll send more. Not assassins next time. Armies. Mages. Things you can't brew an antidote for. With that, they melted into the shadows of the shop and were gone, leaving Valen alone with the parchment and the crushing weight of realization. Outside, the village bell began to toll, not the warning peal of approaching armies, but the steady, mournful rhythm of a funeral dirge. Distant shouts echoed, growing closer. Valen staggered to the window, pushing aside a drying bundle of lavender. On the road leading into Willow's Rest, a column of smoke rose against the clear blue sky. Not from a campfire, but from something larger. Buildings. And marching toward the village, visible now on the horizon, were the banners of the Economic Liberation Army, 1,000 strong, a moving forest of spears and armor, their advance lighting the countryside with the glow of burning towns in their wake. The contract had been signed. The war had begun. Valen woke to the scent of chamomile and the ache of a mind stretched too thin. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of his shop, illuminating motes of pollen that danced like gold dust. He sat at his workbench, the simple wooden surface scarred by years of crafting, and stared at the stack of reports Rorik had delivered at dawn. The Copper Fong leader had arrived grim-faced, his armor still bearing the grime of the road. They're burning everything between here and Riverbend, Rorik had said, voice low. But that's not the worst of it. He'd placed the parchments on the bench, trade ledgers from merchants, panic-stricken letters from guild masters, and official bulletins stamped with royal seals. Read these. The world is falling apart, and they're blaming your potions. For hours, Valen pored over the documents, his fingers tracing columns of numbers that told a story of collapse. The kingdom of Erelon's treasury had lost 40% of its value in 3 months. The Alchemist Guild's monopoly on healing elixirs, once priced at 50 gold pieces per vial, had crumbled entirely, replaced by whispers of Willow's Rest miracles sold for coppers. In Karthus, the gem trade had stalled when dragon envoys returned with artifacts that made mine jewels seem dull by comparison. Viridia's military contracts for enchanted weapons were being cancelled, adventurers preferring to make the pilgrimage to a remote village rather than pay guild prices. It's all connected, Valen murmured to the empty shop. He remembered the villagers' stories, Garrett's son healed of a fever, Marta's arthritis eased, the crops in nearby fields growing unnaturally robust after he'd sprinkled leftover herb mixtures. Each act of kindness, each fair price, had rippled outward like stones cast into a still pond. Only this pond was the global economy, and the ripples were tidal waves. He stood, his joints protesting, and walked to the shelf where his simplest potions sat in humble clay bottles. A healing draught made from dandelions and willow bark. A stamina tonic brewed from wild garlic and rainwater. Common ingredients, transformed through divine craft deconstruction into something more. He'd never considered the consequences beyond helping his neighbors. The legendary blacksmith who forged the sword that slew the Demon King had retired seeking peace, only to unleash chaos with a discount. A knock at the door startled him. Thorin, the village elder, entered without waiting, his face lined with worry deeper than his years. They're coming, Valen. The army. Scouts say they'll reach Willow's Rest by nightfall. I know, Valen said quietly. He gestured to the reports. And I finally understand why. Thorin's eyes scanned the parchments, his literacy a relic of better days. Gods above. You've undone centuries of trade in a season. I never meant. Intentions don't matter to starving merchants or bankrupt kings, Thorin interrupted, not unkindly. What matters is what you do now. The village stands with you, but we cannot fight an army of thousands. Valen nodded, his mind already turning to the problem. Not as a blacksmith shaping metal, but as a craftsman of systems. Divine craft deconstruction wasn't just for items, he'd used it to analyze alchemical tools, trade routes, even the assassin's poison. Could it unravel an economic collapse? He sat back down, closing his eyes. The mental exhaustion from creating the dragon artifacts, transforming the farm tools, and brewing the antidote still lingered like a fog, but he pushed through it. Focus. Analysis. Improvement. In his mind's eye, the world's economy unfolded not as numbers on parchment, but as a vast, intricate mechanism. Gears of guild monopolies grinding against each other. Chains of supply and demand stretched taut. Valves of taxation and tariffs clogged with greed. And at the center, his potion shop, a single, perfectly crafted cog that didn't fit, causing the entire machine to shudder and scream. He saw the flaws immediately. The Alchemist Guild's prices were artificially inflated by scarcity they manufactured. The Adventurers' Union relied on expensive gear to justify membership fees. Kingdoms hoarded wealth in vaults rather than circulating it. Dragon treasuries valued rarity over utility. Each system was designed to benefit the powerful at the expense of the many. But how to fix it without causing more harm? Valen's breathing deepened, sweat beading on his forehead. This was harder than forging a sword or brewing a potion. Those were tangible, immediate. Economics was abstract, woven into the fabric of society. To reshape it required not just divine ability, but profound understanding. He reached for a blank parchment and a charcoal stick. His hand moved almost without conscious thought, guided by the insights flowing through divine craft deconstruction. Diagrams appeared, circles representing kingdoms, lines for trade routes, symbols for goods. He drafted clauses for fair pricing based on actual cost plus reasonable profit. He designed a tiered system where common items remained affordable while rare artifacts retained value. He proposed guild reforms that emphasized quality over monopoly. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then began its descent. Valen's world narrowed to the parchment and the vision in his mind. He sacrificed not materials this time, but something equally precious, the peaceful retirement he dreamed of. Each line of the agreement cost him days of potential relaxation, weeks of quiet gardening, months of slow life simplicity. The mental strain was different from physical exhaustion, it was the weight of responsibility settling on shoulders that had carried a hero's burden once before and thought themselves finally free. By late afternoon, he had it. A simple trade agreement, just 3 pages long, titled The Willow Accord. It wasn't perfect, no system crafted by mortal or god ever was, but it was balanced. It allowed for profit without exploitation, growth without collapse, innovation without destruction. It recognized the value of his divine crafting while integrating it into the existing world rather than overthrowing it. He leaned back, his vision blurring. The cost had been steep. He felt older, wearier, as if he'd aged years in a single day. But there was satisfaction, too, the craftsman's pride in a job well done. Thorin, who had waited silently by the door, approached. "Will it work?" "It could," Valen said, his voice hoarse. "If they'll listen." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the village road. Not the thunder of an army, but the precise cadence of multiple mounted parties arriving together. Valen stood, gathering the accord, and stepped outside. The scene that greeted him was unlike any Willow's Rest had ever witnessed. At the head of the village's single dirt street, a delegation had assembled, and it represented every power that had been threatening him. To the left, Elara stood beside a stern-faced man in alchemist robes embroidered with gold thread, the sigil of the kingdom's alchemist guild gleaming on his chest. Behind them, a dozen guild enforcers in polished armor, their expressions unreadable. To the right, a representative from the Adventurers' Union, a woman with scarred hands and practical leathers, flanked by warriors who bore the marks of recent battle. Their banners showed the crossed sword and scroll of the Union, but they made no hostile move. At the center, most astonishing of all, stood a figure in dragon-scale armor that shimmered with inner light. Not Sithrax, but another envoy from the Dragon King's treasury, holding a staff topped with a gem that pulsed with ancient power. And behind these 3 groups, messengers from the human kingdoms, Erelon's colors in blue and silver, Karthus in green and gold, Viridia in crimson and black. They stood apart from each other, tension crackling between them like static before a storm. Every eye was fixed on Valen. The humble potion shop owner in his simple apron, clutching 3 pages of parchment that held the fate of economies in their words. The dragon envoy stepped forward first, its voice resonating with depths no human throat could produce. "Valen, forger of legends. The signatories of the Pact of Economic Restoration demand audience. The world economy teeters on the brink. You will present your solution or face consequences beyond your comprehension." Elara spoke next, her usual sternness tempered by something like regret. "The guild has authorized me to negotiate, but only if you demonstrate understanding of the damage caused." The adventurer representative merely nodded, her hand resting on her sword hilt. My people are starving because markets have collapsed. We need answers. Now. Valen looked from face to face, alchemists, adventurers, dragons, king's men. All united not by friendship, but by shared crisis. All here, at his doorstep, because of roadside weeds transformed into miracles. He took a deep breath, the accord in his hand feeling suddenly heavier than any legendary sword he'd ever forged. Then let's talk, he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had sacrificed his peace to save a world he never meant to threaten. But you'll need to come inside. The shop isn't built for summits. As he turned to lead them in, he caught Thorin's eye. The elder gave a slight, grim nod. The battle wasn't with swords or spells today. It would be fought with words, economics, and the fragile hope that a retired blacksmith's simple agreement could mend what his simple potions had broken. And outside, on the horizon, the dust cloud of the Economic Liberation Army continued its advance, a reminder that time, like markets, waited for no one. The air in Valen's potion shop thickened with the scent of tension and dried herbs. 7 representatives crowded around the simple wooden counter, their presence making the cozy space feel like a battlefield. Valen stood behind the counter, his apron stained with soil from the morning's gardening, looking more like a weary farmer than the architect of global economic collapse. Ilara stood beside the stern guild master from the kingdom's alchemist guild, his robes embroidered with alchemical symbols that glimmered with restrained magic. Across from them, the scarred female representative from the Adventurers' Union leaned against a shelf of healing potions, her armor scuffed from recent travel. The dragon envoy occupied the doorway, his scale armor catching the morning light in prismatic flashes, while the 3 kingdom messengers, one from Erelon in blue silks, another from Karthus in practical leathers, and the third from Viridia in green velvet, clustered near the window. This shop must be dismantled, the guild master began, his voice like grinding stones. Your potions have rendered our entire alchemical industry obsolete. Healing drafts that took months to brew now sell for coppers instead of gold. The Adventurers' Union has lost 3/4 of its revenue, the scarred woman cut in, her hand resting on her sword hilt. Why pay for dungeon expeditions when a common weed from your garden cures wounds better than legendary artifacts? A low rumble came from the dragon envoy. The Dragon King's treasury has seen its hoard devalued by 40%. Gold means nothing when your simple creations outperform centuries of collected treasures. Valen listened, his mind still aching from the mental exhaustion of drafting the Willow Accord. He could feel the weight of their anger, not as personal malice, but as the desperate flailing of systems breaking under pressure. Through the shop's open door, he could see Rorik and his Copper Fong company standing guard outside, their newly crafted weapons gleaming, while villagers peeked from behind cottages, their faces pale with fear. My lords and ladies, Valen said quietly, his voice raspy from lack of proper rest. I never intended. Intentions matter little when kingdoms starve, the Erelon messenger snapped. Farmers in our northern provinces can't sell their crops because your growth potions make barren land fertile overnight. And our southern trade routes have collapsed, added the Karthus messenger. Why transport goods across continents when your preservation elixirs make spoilage obsolete? The arguments swirled around him like a storm. Valen closed his eyes, feeling the familiar pull of divine craft deconstruction awakening despite his exhaustion. He didn't activate it fully, not yet, but let it analyze the room. The guild master's rigid posture spoke of fear disguised as authority. The adventurer's scarred knuckles told of battles fought for diminishing rewards. The dragon envoy's scales shimmered with anxiety about a changing world. The messenger's fine clothes couldn't hide the economic desperation in their eyes. You're all saying the same thing, Valen murmured, opening his eyes. Silence fell. What? The guild master demanded. Your economies are built on scarcity, Valen said, leaning forward on the counter. Rare ingredients. Difficult processes. Limited distribution. My potions, they're not magic. Not in the way you think. They're just, efficient. He reached under the counter and pulled out the Willow Accord, the 3 simple pages looking absurdly inadequate against the weight of their problems. I've drafted this. It proposes. Paper won't stop armies, the Viridia messenger interrupted. The Economic Liberation Army burns its way toward this village even as we speak. They'll be here by nightfall. Valen's hands trembled slightly. He could feel the mental fatigue like a physical weight, the cost of overusing his ability still fresh. But he pushed through, focusing on the scrap metal he'd collected from the village blacksmith, discarded nails, broken hinges, a rusted horseshoe. Then we need something more than paper, Valen said. He placed the scrap metal on the counter, the mundane collection looking pitiful against the representative's finery. Closing his eyes fully this time, he activated divine craft deconstruction. The world dissolved into patterns of energy and intention. The guild master's demand for restored prices became a rigid structure of control. The adventurer's need for valuable quests transformed into flowing currents of opportunity. The dragon's hoarding instinct manifested as glittering nodes of accumulation. The kingdom's trade systems appeared as interconnected webs, some strands fraying, others pulled too taut. Valen's breathing grew labored. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he forced his mind to work despite the exhaustion. This wasn't like analyzing a potion or a weapon, this was synthesizing entire economic philosophies into something tangible. The mental strain felt like trying to lift a mountain with bare hands. He opened his eyes, his vision swimming. The scrap metal began to glow with a soft, golden light. The representative stepped back, even the dragon envoy looking unsettled. "What sorcery is this?" the guild master whispered. "Not sorcery," Valen gasped, his hands moving over the metal without touching it. "Just, understanding." The pieces fused together, not melting but weaving into a complex lattice. Rust transformed into gleaming copper. Bent nails straightened into precise rods. The horseshoe reshaped itself into a circular frame. As Valen worked, he could feel his physical stamina draining, not just mental exhaustion now, but a deep weariness that reached into his bones. His shoulders slumped, and he had to brace himself against the counter. "He's killing himself," Elara said, her professional detachment cracking for the first time. But Valen didn't stop. The lattice grew more intricate, patterns emerging that mirrored trade routes, supply chains, and value exchanges. Tiny crystals formed at the intersections, each glowing with a different hue, blue for alchemical goods, red for adventuring gear, gold for treasure, green for agricultural products. When it was done, a device about the size of a bread loaf sat on the counter. It looked like an impossible clockwork mechanism, gears turning without touching, crystals pulsing with inner light. Valen collapsed into his stool, breathing heavily, his face pale. "The economic stabilizer," he managed to say. "It models balance." The dragon envoy reached out a scaled hand, then hesitated. "How does it work?" "Place your hand on it," Valen said weakly. "All of you." They exchanged suspicious glances. The guild master was the first to comply, his wrinkled hand resting on the cool metal. Then the adventurer representative, her scarred fingers tentative. The dragon envoy placed a single claw. The three messengers added their hands last. The device activated. Light exploded from the crystals, not blinding but immersive. The shop dissolved around them, replaced by a vision of the world as it could be. They saw fields where farmers grew both common crops and rare herbs, with Valen's potions used to enhance rather than replace. They watched alchemists brewing complex elixirs that incorporated divine craft principles without making simple potions obsolete. Adventurers undertook quests for artifacts that complemented rather than competed with god-tier gear. Dragon hoards glittered with treasures whose value came from artistry rather than scarcity. Trade routes flowed like rivers, connecting kingdoms in networks of mutual benefit rather than competition. Prices stabilized at levels that allowed both prosperity and challenge. The Economic Liberation Army in the vision laid down their weapons, their grievances addressed through the new system. The vision showed Willow's Rest not as ground zero for economic collapse, but as a hub, a place where Valen's shop taught others his methods, where guilds sent apprentices to learn, where dragon envoys came to trade knowledge rather than demand tribute. "It's beautiful," the scarred adventurer whispered, her warrior's cynicism melting away. "But can it be real?" the Karthus messenger asked. Before Valen could answer, movement flashed at the edge of the vision. Shadows detached themselves from the corners of the shop, figures that hadn't been there moments before. They wore no insignia, their faces obscured by dark cloth, but their movements were too precise, too coordinated to be random villagers. "Assassins!" Rorik shouted from outside, but he was too far away. 6 figures converged on the economic stabilizer. They moved with unnatural speed, their weapons gleaming with enchantments meant to disrupt magic. The guild master tried to interpose himself, but one assassin shoved him aside with brutal efficiency. The dragon envoy roared, scales bristling, but 2 more assassins surrounded him, their blades glowing with dragon-slaying runes. The vision shattered as the lead assassin grabbed the stabilizer. The device's light flickered wildly, crystals cracking under the violent theft. Valen tried to rise, but his exhausted body refused to obey. He could only watch as the assassin sprinted for the door, the precious artifact clutched to his chest. "Stop him!" Elara cried, but she was pinned by another assassin's dagger at her throat. The scarred adventurer lunged, her sword meeting an assassin's blade in a shower of sparks. Outside, Rorik and his company fought their way toward the shop, but more dark-clad figures emerged from hiding places around the village. The lead assassin reached the doorway, then paused. He turned back, his eyes meeting Valen's through the slit in his mask. There was no triumph in that gaze, only cold purpose. Then he was gone, vanishing into the morning shadows between cottages, the economic stabilizer with him. The remaining assassins disengaged, melting away as quickly as they'd appeared. The shop fell into chaos, representatives shouting, villagers screaming outside, the dragon envoy bellowing in rage. Valen slumped forward on the counter, his energy completely spent. The artifact was gone. The vision of peace was stolen. And somewhere out there, a rogue faction now possessed a device that could reshape the world's economy, for better or for worse. The moon hung like a tarnished silver coin over Willow's Rest, casting long shadows through the single window of Valen's potion shop. Inside, the air still carried the scent of crushed herbs and ozone from the day's failed summit. Valen lay on a cot behind the counter, his breathing shallow and uneven. Even in sleep, his mind churned with the afterimages of economic systems visualized as intricate clockwork mechanisms, gears grinding against one another in disharmony. The theft of the economic stabilizer had left a hollow ache in his chest, a physical manifestation of his exhaustion. He dreamed of hammers striking anvils, but the sound was wrong, too sharp, too metallic. It wasn't until the third dream hammer blow that Valen's eyes snapped open. The sound was real. Someone was prying at the shop's back door. Valen pushed himself upright, every muscle protesting. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the cot. The mental exhaustion from drafting the willow accord had settled into his bones like lead, and the physical drain from crafting the stabilizer had left him feeling decades older than his true age. Yet survival instincts honed over a lifetime of forging weapons for wars he'd never fought kicked in. He slid off the cot silently, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Through the crack in the door to his back room, he saw three figures silhouetted against the moonlight. They moved with practiced efficiency, not the clumsy desperation of common thieves. One held a crowbar, another a set of lockpicks that gleamed with unnatural sharpness, and the third carried a leather satchel that bulged with tools. Their clothing was dark and nondescript, but Valen's divine craft deconstruction, even in his depleted state, flared to life instinctively. He didn't need to touch them. He simply focused, and information flowed into his mind like water through a cracked dam. The analysis cost him, a fresh wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to brace himself against the wall. But the knowledge came, these weren't random looters. They were professionals hired by a secondary consortium of merchant lords from the coastal cities, men who had profited from the very economic instability Valen had unwittingly created. Their motive wasn't to destroy his shop, but to seize any remaining prototypes or notes about the stabilizer, to control the solution rather than let it become public. Valen's lips pressed into a thin line. He had no energy for a fight. He could barely stand. But he had his shop, and his shop was filled with possibilities. As the thieves finally forced the back door open with a soft splintering sound, Valen was already moving. He didn't head for the door. Instead, he stumbled toward his brewing station. His hands, though shaking, moved with the precision of a master craftsman. He grabbed a handful of dried slipweed from a jar, a common herb villagers used to polish floors. With his divine craft deconstruction still active, he analyzed its properties: extremely low friction when crushed, adhesive when mixed with certain catalysts. He crushed the slipweed in his mortar, his movements hurried but exact. From a shelf, he took a vial of rendered goose fat, normally used to seal potion bottles. He mixed them together, his ability showing him the perfect proportions. The result was a greasy, translucent paste. He smeared it across the floorboards in a wide arc just inside the doorway, then scattered a handful of dried peas from his kitchen stores over it. The peas, analyzed in a flash, became perfect rolling spheres when combined with the paste. The first thief stepped inside, his boot landing squarely in the mixture. His foot shot out from under him with comical suddenness. He crashed to the floor with a choked gasp, the crowbar clattering away. The second thief, rushing in behind him, tripped over his companion and landed hard. The third hesitated in the doorway, eyes widening. Valen was already at his drying rack. He snatched a bundle of thunderroot, a weed villagers avoided because it caused mild static shocks when handled. Divine craft deconstruction showed him its electrical potential. He tore the roots apart, exposing their moist cores, and tossed them into a copper mixing bowl. From his tool drawer, he grabbed a handful of iron nails and a length of copper wire salvaged from a broken lamp. His mind worked feverishly, visualizing a simple circuit. He arranged the nails around the bowl's rim, connected them with the wire, and placed the thunder root in the center. The third thief drew a short sword and advanced cautiously, avoiding the slippery patch. Valen didn't wait. He touched the wire to the bowl's edge. A spark jumped, tiny but bright in the dark shop. The thunder root reacted instantly, releasing a stored charge amplified by the crude circuit. A crackle of blue-white electricity arced from the bowl, not enough to injure but sufficient to shock. The thief yelped, his sword dropping as his muscles spasmed. He stumbled back into his still-prone companions. Valen's vision swam. He leaned heavily on the counter, sweat beading on his forehead. Each use of his ability felt like dragging stones uphill. But he wasn't done. The thieves were recovering, scrambling to their feet with angry snarls. They spread out, trying to flank him. His eyes fell on his potion shelves. Dozens of bottles gleamed in the moonlight. Most were harmless healing brews, but one batch had been experimental, an attempt to create a non-lethal deterrent for garden pests. He'd used crushed dreamflower petals and fermented honey, analyzing their properties to induce temporary drowsiness. The formula was unstable, requiring precise agitation to activate. As the first thief lunged, Valen grabbed the bottle. He shook it violently 3 times, the exact rhythm his ability showed him would trigger the reaction. Then he hurled it at the floor between them. The glass shattered. A cloud of sweet-scented mist erupted, spreading rapidly. The thieves inhaled, their movements slowing. Their eyes grew heavy. One by one, they slumped to the floor, unconscious before they hit the boards. Valen sagged against the counter, breathing ragged. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but he felt as though he'd run for miles. His mind was a numb void, his body trembling with fatigue. He looked at the 3 sleeping forms, then at the makeshift traps he'd created from slipweed, peas, thunderroot, and dreamflower potions. A weary smile touched his lips. Even like this, he could still craft solutions. He was about to check on the thieves when a low hum filled the shop. It started as a vibration in the floorboards, then grew into a resonant thrum that made the glass bottles on the shelves tremble. Valen turned, his exhaustion forgotten for a moment. The sound was coming from the back room, from where he'd hidden the stolen economic stabilizers casing after the summit. He'd kept the empty shell, hoping to study it for clues about the thieves. He staggered to the back room. The metal casing, a twisted sculpture of nails, hinges, and horseshoe, was glowing with a soft amber light. It pulsed in time with the hum, each pulse sending a ripple through the air that Valen felt in his teeth. He reached out, his divine craft deconstruction activating one last time, a final drain on his reserves. The analysis was fragmentary, blurred by his exhaustion, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The stabilizer hadn't been just an economic tool. In its creation, he'd inadvertently woven principles of divine crafting into a form that resonated with deeper forces. And now, activated by the day's events and the nearby use of his ability, it was emitting a signal, a pulse of pure economic harmony that cut through the world's financial discord like a clarion call. And something was answering. Beneath the floor, beneath the very foundations of Willow's Rest, Valen sensed a presence stirring. Not a physical entity, but a consciousness older than kingdoms, slumbering in the bedrock of the continent. It was vast, slow-moving, and fundamentally tied to the flow of wealth and resources. An ancient economic deity, dormant for millennia, had sensed the stabilizer's pulse. Its attention was turning upward, toward the source of the disturbance. Toward him. The hum deepened into a subsonic roar that Valen felt in his bones. The glow from the casing brightened, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the night sky remained clear, but a pressure built in the air, thick and expectant. Somewhere far below, in darkness older than history, something had opened an eye. Valen stood frozen, the last of his strength gone, as the thunder of awakening echoed through the silent shop. The tremors began as a faint vibration in the floorboards, like the distant rumble of a passing wagon. Valen, slumped against his workbench with the last of his energy spent capturing the thieves, felt the vibration through his aching bones. He opened his eyes, the simple motion requiring more effort than forging a dozen swords in his prime. The empty casing of the economic stabilizer glowed with an eerie, pulsating light on the counter, casting shifting shadows across the shop's cozy interior. Then the world shook. It wasn't an earthquake of stone and soil. This was something deeper, more fundamental. The very air in Valen's verdant bruise thickened with pressure, making each breath feel like drawing syrup through a straw. Shelves rattled, potion bottles chimed against one another in a discordant melody, and dust rained from the ceiling beams. Outside, through the shop's small windows, Valen saw the village of Willow's Rest trembling, not collapsing, but shimmering as if reality itself had grown unstable. He pushed himself upright, every muscle protesting. His mind, aged and exhausted from weeks of relentless divine craft deconstruction, felt like cracked glass about to shatter. Yet something in the vibration called to the blacksmith in him, the part that had once shaped divine metals with nothing but focus and will. This wasn't natural disaster. This was purpose. The ground beneath the shop split open. No earth crumbled, no foundation gave way. Instead, the floorboards parted like curtains, revealing not darkness but a swirling vortex of golden light and shifting numbers. Ledgers floated in that light, ancient scrolls of trade agreements, coins from forgotten empires, and the ghostly impressions of marketplaces across millennia. From this impossible space rose a figure. It had no fixed form. One moment it appeared as a towering giant clad in robes woven from trade routes, its eyes glowing with the cold calculation of profit margins. The next it shimmered into a serpent of coins and contracts, scales made of stamped gold and clauses. Then it settled into something vaguely humanoid, a being of light and shadow, with hands that flickered between open palms offering wealth and clenched fists crushing economies. Mortal. The voice wasn't sound. It was the crash of markets collapsing, the whisper of coins changing hands, the roar of caravans on ancient roads. It vibrated through Valen's shop, through his bones, through the very concept of value in the region. You have disrupted the balance. Valen leaned heavily on his workbench. The three captured thieves, bound with ropes he'd improvised from curtain cords, cowered in the corner. The empty stabilizer casing pulsed faster, as if answering the deity's presence. I sought only to help my neighbors, Valen said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. Help. The deity's form solidified into that of an ancient merchant king, crowned with scales that weighed justice and greed in equal measure. You have torn the fabric of natural exchange. For millennia, I have slumbered beneath this continent, allowing markets to flow like rivers, sometimes flooding, sometimes drought-stricken, but always following their natural course. Your divine crafting is a dam built across every waterway. The shop's walls shimmered. Valen saw visions flash in the air, the kingdom's alchemist guild collapsing as apprentices realized they could buy better potions for copper coins instead of gold. The Adventurers Union's entire equipment economy rendered worthless by a single improved whetstone. The Dragon King's treasury, mountains of gold suddenly meaningless when common herbs could heal wounds better than dragon-scale salves. You offered discounts, the deity thundered, and this time actual thunder cracked outside. You made the divine accessible. You flattened the pyramid of scarcity upon which all economies are built. Valen closed his eyes. In his mind's eye, he saw not the deity's anger, but the pattern behind it. This wasn't a monster to be slain like the Demon King. This was a system, ancient, vast, and fundamentally flawed. And systems were what divine craft deconstruction was made to analyze. He pushed the last of his mental energy forward. The world narrowed to golden light and shifting numbers. Valen's consciousness, worn thin as old parchment, stretched out toward the economic deity. He didn't attack. He didn't defend. He analyzed. Divine craft deconstruction unfolded in his mind not as a weapon, but as a lens. He saw the deity's essence, not as a living being, but as the accumulated belief of countless generations that value must be scarce, that markets must have winners and losers, that economy was a zero-sum game. He saw the cracks in that belief, the villages that starved while guilds hoarded, the adventurers who died with empty purses, the dragons who measured worth in glittering piles rather than lived experience. You're afraid, Valen whispered, the realization coming not as accusation but as observation. The deity's form flickered. I am order. I am the natural flow of. You're a system built on fear, Valen interrupted, his voice gaining strength from the clarity of analysis. Fear of scarcity. Fear of loss. Fear that if everyone has enough, nothing will have value. But that's not crafting, that's just poor design. He took a step forward, his body protesting but his mind now focused with terrible clarity. The deity towered over him, but Valen looked up not at a god, but at a mechanism in need of adjustment. I can show you another way, Valen said. Not destruction. Not maintaining the old imbalances. A partnership. The word hung in the charged air. The deity's form shifted through a dozen ancient economic models, barter systems, gold standards, complex mercantile networks, all showing the same fundamental flaw. Partnership? The voice held the skepticism of 1,000 bankrupt merchants. You, a retired blacksmith in an apron, would partner with the embodiment of economic force. I forged the sword that slew the demon king not because I sought glory, Valen said, his hands, calloused from a lifetime at the anvil, spread in a gesture that was neither submission nor challenge. I forged it because the design was flawed, and I could make it better. Your system is flawed. Let me help you craft a better one. The ground trembled again, but differently this time, not with anger, but with consideration. The golden light in the shop softened, becoming less blinding, more analytical. The deity's form settled into that of an ancient scholar, scrolls of economic theory floating around it like satellites. The cost, the deity said, and now its voice held the weight of inevitable transaction. Balance requires sacrifice. You have enjoyed your retirement, your simple shop, your quiet life. To craft a new system, you must give that up. Valen felt the words like a physical blow. He saw it all, the morning sunlight through his shop window, the smell of brewing herbs, the satisfaction of a customer's grateful smile. The peace he'd fought a war to earn. The slow life he'd built one careful day at a time. How much, he asked, the question tearing from him. Substantial, the deity said, not unkindly. You will not return to battlefields, but your retirement as you know it ends today. The work ahead will consume years of the peace you hoarded. You will become not a shopkeeper, but an architect of economies. The apron traded for the blueprint. Valen looked around his shop. At the herbs drying from the rafters. At the simple sign outside that read Valen's verdant brews. At the 3 thieves, now watching with wide eyes, understanding dawning that they'd tried to rob the man negotiating with a god. He thought of Garrett's son, Kellen, healed by a potion made from roadside weeds. Of Marta, her arthritis eased. Of the entire village thriving because he'd offered fair prices. That was the craft, too, not just the making, but the giving. I accept, Valen said, and the words felt like signing a contract in his own blood. The deity nodded, the motion causing coins to materialize and vanish in the air around it. Then forge me a pact of prosperity. Not an economic stabilizer to patch the old system, but a new foundation. Incorporate the principles of your divine crafting, that value can be created, not just hoarded. That abundance, properly structured, benefits all. It extended a hand that shimmered between flesh and golden light. You have 3 days. Gather what you need from this world, materials, allies, insights. But know this, if you fail, or if you attempt to deceive me with half measures, I will not destroy you. I will unmake the very concept of your crafting. Divine craft deconstruction will become a forgotten dream, and every potion you ever sold will turn to dust in its bottle. The economic liberation army approaching will find nothing but a broken old man in an empty shop. The threat hung in the air, cold and precise as a merchant's final offer. 3 days, Valen repeated, his mind already turning from shopkeeper to blacksmith, from retiree to architect. He saw the challenge not as a threat, but as a design problem. The pact of prosperity would need to be more than an artifact, it would need to be a system embodied, a new economic reality forged in divine metal and mortal principle. The deity's form began to dissolve back into the golden vortex. Begin, craftsman. The clock starts now. And remember, you bargained away your peace for this chance. See that the design is worth the price. With a final tremor that shook dust from every shelf in Willow's Rest, the deity vanished. The floorboards sealed themselves, leaving no trace of the golden light. Only the empty stabilizer casing remained, its glow now steady rather than pulsing, as if waiting. Valen stood alone in his shop, the weight of the task settling on his shoulders heavier than any anvil. Outside, dawn was breaking. Somewhere to the east, the Economic Liberation Army marched closer. In kingdoms across the continent, guilds and treasuries held their breath. And in a humble potion shop, a retired blacksmith who had just bargained away his hard-won peace looked at his hands, then at the world waiting to be remade. 3 days. He took a deep breath, the smell of herbs and brewing potions filling his lungs one last time as a simple shopkeeper. Then he reached for his apron, untied it slowly, and folded it neatly on the counter. The fabric, stained with years of honest work, seemed to watch him as he turned toward the door. The crafting of a new world began with a single step. The first light of dawn found Valen standing in the small clearing behind his potion shop, the apron he'd worn for months now folded neatly on a weathered wooden bench. His hands, once calloused from hammer and anvil, now trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into his marrow. 3 days. The economic deity's ultimum echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. He knelt on the dew-damp grass, arranging his materials with deliberate care, a lump of common river clay dug from the bank behind the village mill, a wooden bucket filled with clear well water, and the morning sunlight filtering through the oak leaves overhead. Mundane. Utterly ordinary. Yet these were the ingredients the deity had specified when it whispered the ritual into his mind before dissolving back into the earth. Begin with what is, the voice had said, a chorus of market fluctuations and trade winds. Forge what should be. Valen closed his eyes, drawing a breath that tasted of damp soil and distant rain. Divine craft deconstruction unfolded within him, not as a tool this time, but as a lens through which reality itself could be remade. He saw the clay not as simple earth, but as a matrix of microscopic structures holding memory of river currents and ancient stone. The water became a tapestry of hydrogen bonds and mineral traces, each droplet containing the history of mountain snowmelt and underground aquifers. The sunlight transformed into packets of energy that had traveled 8 minutes through vacuum to reach this patch of grass. His hands moved without conscious thought, kneading clay into a rough sphere about the size of a human heart. Water mixed in measured drips, the consistency shifting from crumbly to pliable. As he worked, Valen channeled principles he'd learned over a lifetime at the forge. Balance requires tension, structure demands flexibility, permanence emerges from constant small adjustments. These weren't economic theories, they were truths written in steel grain and cooling patterns, now applied to a different kind of creation. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. The mental effort of maintaining divine craft deconstruction at this intensity felt like holding up a collapsing ceiling with bare hands. Each second stretched into agony as he analyzed not just the materials, but the concepts they needed to embody: fair exchange without exploitation, growth without depletion, innovation without obsolescence. He began whispering the principles into the clay, words that weren't language but intent shaped into sound vibrations. Value flows like water, block it and it stagnates, force it and it floods. The sphere pulsed with a soft golden light. Scarcity is an illusion maintained by gates, remove the gates, and abundance reveals itself. The light deepened to amber. Hours passed. The sun climbed, and Valen's body screamed protest. His muscles trembled from maintaining the same kneeling position. His mind, already frayed from previous overuse of his divine ability, began to unravel at the edges. Memories surfaced unbidden, the heat of his first forge as an apprentice, the weight of the sword he'd made to slay the demon king, the simple satisfaction of measuring herbs for a customer's cough remedy. He pushed them aside, focusing on the artifact taking shape between his palms. The clay had transformed beyond its physical nature, it now held the imprints of every economic interaction he'd witnessed since opening his shop. The suspicious glance of Garrett buying that first healing potion. Ilara's stern audit that became grudging respect. The desperate greed in the thief's eyes. The dragon envoy's confusion at concepts beyond hoarding. Suddenly, the sphere began to rotate on its own, hovering an inch above his palms. Runes etched themselves across its surface, not carved, but emerging from within the material as if they'd always been there waiting to be revealed. They glowed with the same amber light, patterns that suggested both mathematical precision and organic growth. Valen's breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel his life force draining into the artifact, not as magic, but as focus, the accumulated attention of a master craftsman poured into a single creation. His vision blurred. The clearing swam around him, trees becoming smears of green, the shop a brown blotch in the periphery. He didn't notice the first shadows gathering at the tree line. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of planning and desperation. From the north emerged figures in the grey cloaks of the kingdom's alchemist guild, not investigators this time, but combat alchemists with vials glowing with destructive energies at their belts. From the south came warriors bearing the crossed sword and coin emblem of the Adventurers' Union, their armor scarred from recent battles, faces set in grim determination. From the west slithered scaled forms in humanoid shape, dragonkin sent by the treasury, their eyes burning with the fury of threatened wealth. "He's creating it," shouted a guild alchemist, a woman with acid-burned hands. "Destroy the artifact before it solidifies the new order." "Our livelihoods depend on scarcity," roared an Adventurers' Union captain, hefting a massive warhammer. "That thing promises abundance for all, what value do our skills have then?" "The hoard must remain the measure of worth," hissed a dragonkin, claws extending. This balance would make gold no different than clay. They charged as one. Valen's eyes snapped open. The artifact was at a critical phase, the principles needed only minutes more to fully integrate. If he stopped now, the clay would harden into a useless lump, the deity's ultimatum would fail, and everything he built would unravel. But if he didn't defend himself, he'd be dead before completion. With a groan that tore from his very soul, Valen did what no ordinary craftsman could, he split his focus. One thread of divine craft deconstruction continued channeling into the hovering sphere, maintaining the delicate infusion of economic principles. Another thread analyzed the incoming threats with cold, desperate efficiency. The combat alchemists were already hurling their vials. Valen saw the trajectories not as arcs of glass, but as equations of motion. He snatched up his wooden water bucket with his free hand, the same hand that still cradled the artifact's energy, and swung it in a precise parry. The bucket intercepted 3 vials mid-air, their contents mixing harmlessly against the wet wood, a corrosion agent neutralized by water, a combustion catalyst with nothing to ignite, a paralysis gas diluted to impotence. The warhammer came next, swung in a decapitating arc by the Union captain. Valen didn't dodge, he couldn't without breaking his connection to the artifact. Instead, he dropped to one knee, letting the hammer pass over his head while his other hand scooped up a handful of the remaining clay. As the captain overbalanced from the missed swing, Valen slapped the clay onto the hammer's head. Divine craft deconstruction flared for a microsecond, analyzing and altering the metal's crystalline structure. The hammerhead instantly quadrupled in weight, wrenching the weapon from the captain's grip to thud into the earth, too heavy to lift. The dragonkin were upon him then, 3 of them moving with reptilian speed. Claws aimed for his throat, his heart, the artifact. Valen did the only thing left, he breathed out the last of his energy reserves into the sphere. The amber light flared blindingly bright, and for a heartbeat, pure economic principle radiated outward. The dragonkin froze mid-lunge, their minds overwhelmed by a vision not of wealth, but of worth, the intrinsic value of a sunrise, a shared meal, a skill honed over years rather than gold piled in caves. They staggered back, clutching their heads as centuries of draconic economic thinking collided with a fundamentally different paradigm. But the reprieve was momentary. More attackers emerged from the trees, mercenaries with no allegiance beyond coin, their eyes fixed on the glowing artifact that promised to make their profession obsolete. An arrow whistled toward Valen's chest. He couldn't move. Couldn't defend. Every ounce of his being was funneled into the sphere, which now pulsed with a rhythmic light like a heartbeat. The clay had become translucent, revealing intricate internal structures that shifted and realigned with each pulse. It was almost complete. The arrow struck. Not flesh, but the artifact itself. The projectile, tipped with alchemical disruptors designed to unravel magical constructs, embedded in the sphere's surface. Cracks spiderwebbed outward from the impact point. The amber light flickered, dimmed. Valen screamed, not in pain, but in despair. 3 days of work, his retirement piece sacrificed, the world's hope balanced on this creation, all unraveling because he couldn't hold off one last attack. Then something unexpected happened. The cracks stopped spreading. The arrow's disruptor tip, analyzed in that final instant by divine craft deconstruction, became not a flaw, but a feature. The artifact incorporated the disruption principle, transforming it from destruction to necessary correction, a built-in mechanism to prevent any single power from monopolizing the new economic system. The sphere completed its final transformation. The clay hardened into a material that was neither stone nor metal nor ceramic, but something entirely new. It floated serenely above Valen's palm, radiating a warm, steady light that seemed to promise not utopia, but possibility. The pact of prosperity was forged. But as Valen collapsed forward, utterly spent, the last thing he saw before darkness took him was the leaders of the attacking forces regrouping at the edge of the clearing, their initial shock giving way to renewed determination. They weren't fleeing. They were preparing a final, coordinated assault to shatter the artifact before its influence could spread. The artifact pulsed once, twice, thrice, and began emitting a low hum that vibrated through the very earth. The morning sun rose over Willow's Rest, but instead of the usual quiet dawn, the village trembled with the approach of armies. From the northern road came the disciplined ranks of the kingdom's alchemist guild, alchemists in reinforced leather armor carrying vials that shimmered with destructive potential, flanked by guild enforcers with polished steel weapons. Their banners displayed the crossed alembic and flame, the symbol of their monopoly now threatened to its core. From the east marched the Adventurers' Union, a less uniform but more numerous force of warriors, rangers, and mages, their armor scarred from countless battles, their expressions grim with the desperation of those whose livelihoods had evaporated. And from the southern sky descended the dragonkin of the Dragon King's treasury, 3 massive figures in scale armor that caught the light like molten gold, their wings casting shadows that swallowed the village square. Valen stood before his shop, the Pact of Prosperity artifact cradled in his hands. It was a deceptively simple object, a sphere of fired clay no larger than his palm, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when not directly observed. Cracks from the arrow strike during its forging had healed into silver traceries that pulsed with a faint inner light. The artifact felt warm against his skin, humming with potential energy that vibrated through his bones. He was still exhausted from the previous day's forging, his muscles trembling with fatigue, his mind foggy from overuse of divine craft deconstruction. But he couldn't afford to rest now. Valen. Thorin, the village elder, rushed from his home, his face pale. They've surrounded the village. The guild master demands you surrender the artifact. The Adventurers Union captain says they'll burn the shop if you don't hand it over. And the dragon kin, they're speaking of claiming it as tribute to restore their hoard's value. Valen nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the converging forces. He could see the guild master at the head of his troops, a stern-faced man in elaborate alchemical robes, his expression one of cold calculation. The scarred female representative from the Adventurers Union stood beside her captain, her hand resting on the hilt of a greatsword. The three dragon kin had landed in the square, their presence causing the ground to tremble, their eyes glowing with ancient avarice. They don't understand, Valen murmured, more to himself than to Thorin. They see this as a weapon to control. But it's meant to balance. He raised the artifact, and immediately, three voices shouted commands almost simultaneously. Seize it, the guild master ordered, his alchemists advancing with vials ready to throw. Destroy it before it enslaves us all, the Adventurers Union captain roared, his warriors raising their weapons. The Dragon King claims this artifact as compensation for destabilized treasures, the lead dragonkin thundered, his voice shaking windows in their frames. Valen closed his eyes. He couldn't fight them, not in his current state, and not with the artifact still incomplete. But he could analyze. Divine craft deconstruction activated, not on the artifact this time, but on the aggression itself. His mind expanded, seeing not just soldiers and monsters, but the economic forces driving them, the guild's fear of lost monopoly profits manifesting as chemical aggression, the union's desperation from collapsed adventuring markets transforming into martial fury, the Dragonkin's hoarding instinct corrupted by devalued treasure into territorial rage. He saw the energy patterns, not magical, but economic. The guild's advance carried the momentum of centuries of controlled scarcity. The union's charge held the kinetic force of suddenly worthless contracts and empty guild halls. The Dragonkin's approach embodied the gravitational pull of treasure hoards that had lost half their purchasing power overnight. And Valen understood what he had to do. He channeled divine craft deconstruction through the artifact, not to attack, but to redirect. The clay sphere in his hands grew warmer, the silver traceries blazing with light. He didn't try to stop the advancing armies, instead, he analyzed their aggressive energy and began transforming it. As the first alchemical vials flew toward him, Valen focused on the guild's economic aggression. Through the artifact, he redirected that energy not at himself, but into the local trade routes he'd analyzed weeks before. The vial's destructive potential dissolved into shimmering data streams that flowed into the artifact, then outward, stabilizing prices in nearby towns that had been fluctuating wildly. He saw it happen in his mind's eye, in Oakhaven, where grain prices had been manipulated by guild-backed merchants, sudden equilibrium restored fair trade. In Rivercross, where healing potion costs had skyrocketed after Valen's shop opened, a gentle correction brought them down to reasonable levels without crashing the market entirely. The cost to Valen was immediate and profound. Each redirection felt like tearing a piece of his own tranquility away. The peaceful retirement he'd sacrificed to accept the deities' challenge now eroded further with every economic force he channeled. His vision blurred at the edges, his breathing grew labored, but he kept his hands steady on the artifact. Then the Adventurers Union warriors reached him. Swords swung, arrows flew, spells crackled through the air. Valen didn't dodge, he analyzed their martial aggression through divine craft deconstruction and redirected it too. The warriors' charge, born from the collapse of monster bounty markets and dungeon loot economies, transformed through the artifact into stabilizing energy for local employment. In his mind, Valen saw adventurers in three kingdoms suddenly finding new, sustainable contracts, not the boom-and-bust cycles of monster hunting, but steady work guarding trade caravans, clearing land for farming, even serving as community protectors. The union's fear of obsolescence became the foundation for diversified livelihoods. Another piece of his peace vanished. Valen gasped, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. This wasn't just crafting anymore, it was reshaping lives, economies, entire ways of being. And each adjustment cost him a fragment of the simple life he'd wanted. The dragonkin reached him last, but with the most force. The lead enforcer swung a massive clawed hand, aiming to snatch the artifact from Valen's grasp. Valen analyzed the dragonkin's hoarding aggression, the ancient, deep-seated need to accumulate and protect treasure that had driven dragonkind for millennia. Through the artifact, he redirected that energy into something new, not hoarding, but circulating. The dragonkin's attack dissolved into golden light that flowed into the Pact of Prosperity, then outward to stabilize currency values across the continent. Valen saw dragon hoards not as stagnant piles of wealth, but as potential economic engines, carefully managed reserves that could back currencies, fund infrastructure, create stability rather than provoke wars. The three dragonkin staggered back, confused. Their instinct to hoard had been transformed. Not removed, but refined. Made sustainable. All three armies had stopped their advance. They stood in a rough circle around Valen and his shop, weapons lowered, expressions shifting from aggression to confusion to dawning comprehension. The guild master stared at his hands, then at the artifact. The Adventurers' Union captain looked toward his warriors, then back at Valen. The dragonkin enforcers exchanged glances, their postures less aggressive, more contemplative. "What have you done?" the guild master asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Redirected," Valen said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Your fear. Your desperation. Your hoarding. I've taken the energy you were using to destroy and turned it toward balance." He held up the artifact. The clay sphere was glowing brightly now, the silver traceries blazing like captured lightning. The cracks from the arrow strike had become part of the design, flaw lines that allowed for self-correction, for adaptation. The artifact hummed with power, vibrating at a frequency that seemed to resonate with the very concept of fair exchange. "This isn't a weapon to control economies," Valen continued, addressing all of them. "It's a foundation. A pact. It takes aggressive energy, the kind that causes crashes and panics and wars, and transforms it into stabilizing force. But it needs all of you to work. The guild's knowledge of alchemical value. The union's understanding of labor markets. The dragonkin's instinct for long-term wealth preservation." He was swaying on his feet now. The cost of using divine craft deconstruction at this scale, after days of exhaustion, was catching up to him. Each redirection had required not just mental focus, but emotional investment. He'd had to understand their fears, their motivations, their economic pain points, and transform that understanding into constructive energy. "You want me to cooperate?" the Adventurers' Union representative asked, her scarred face showing disbelief. "With them?" the guild master gestured toward the dragonkin. "For a balanced economy," Valen said simply. "Where your potions have fair value without monopolies. Where adventurers can make a living without market crashes. Where dragon hoard supports stability instead of causing inflation." The artifact in his hands pulsed brighter. The hum grew louder, becoming almost musical, a chord of economic harmony that seemed to vibrate through the air, through the ground, through the very fabric of reality. Valen could feel it activating, the Pact of Prosperity coming to life, ready to establish the new economic foundation the deity had demanded. But the cost had been too high. Valen's vision tunneled. The glowing artifact seemed to recede, its light growing painfully bright. He could feel his consciousness slipping, the exhaustion from days of forging and defending and redirecting finally overwhelming him. His knees buckled. "Valen!" Thorin shouted, rushing forward. The guild master took a step toward him. The Adventurers' Union captain lowered his sword completely. The dragonkin watched, their glowing eyes fixed on the artifact. Valen collapsed. The Pact of Prosperity fell from his hands, but instead of hitting the ground, it hovered in the air, spinning slowly, its light undiminished. It continued to glow, brighter and brighter, on the verge of full activation. The hum became a chorus, filling the village square, reaching toward the sky. Around him, the armies stood frozen, watching the unconscious blacksmith and the artifact that held their economic futures in its glowing, clay form. The final standoff had ended not with violence, but with collapse. And the pact waited, poised between activation and uncertainty, with its creator unconscious and the world watching. Valen's consciousness surfaced like a diver breaking through murky water. His body felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out his bones and replaced them with leaden weariness. Every breath was a labor, every blink an effort against eyelids that wanted to remain sealed forever. He lay on the packed earth floor of his shop, the familiar scent of dried herbs and polished wood now mingled with something new, a crisp, metallic tang like freshly minted coins and morning dew. He pushed himself up, joints protesting, and saw the world had changed. Willow's Rest was no longer the sleepy, remote village he'd chosen for retirement. The air shimmered with a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from the very soil. Villagers moved with purposeful grace, their faces no longer etched with the worry lines of economic uncertainty. Garrett was tending his fields, but the crops glowed with unnatural vitality, leaves shimmering like emeralds under the strange illumination. Marta sat outside her cottage, fingers flexing without the usual arthritic stiffness, a look of wonder on her weathered face. Even the building seemed subtly altered, the thatched roofs gleamed as if woven from sunlight, and the wooden walls bore intricate patterns that hadn't been there before, like the grain of the wood had decided to tell a story of abundance. And above it all, hovering at the center of the village square where the old well stood, was the Pact of Prosperity. The artifact was a masterpiece of impossible geometry. It rotated slowly, a sphere of interlocking rings crafted from the mundane materials Valen had used, clay hardened to diamond-like transparency, water frozen into crystalline lattices, sunlight captured in filaments of gold. But it was more than the sum of its parts. Each rotation sent pulses of harmonious energy through the air, visible as ripples of light that washed over the village and beyond. Where they passed, discord smoothed into cooperation, scarcity whispered into plenty, and fear softened into cautious hope. The cracks from the arrow strike were now elegant fault lines that glowed with internal fire, self-correcting mechanisms humming with divine intent. Valen staggered to his feet, using a workbench for support. His mind, though fogged with exhaustion, recognized the artifact's state. It was complete, but not yet fully integrated. It hovered in a state of potential, waiting for the final adjustments that would bind its principles to the world's economic fabric. And around it, the representatives of the factions stood in uneasy truce. The female combat alchemist from the kingdom's alchemist guild had removed her helmet, revealing sharp features and eyes that darted between the artifact and her guildmates with calculated intensity. Her hands, stained with reagent burns, flexed near her belt pouches as if itching to throw another explosive vial. The Adventurers' Union captain, a burly man with a scar across his jawline, had sheathed his sword but kept his posture rigid, muscles coiled like springs. The 3 Dragonkin enforcers from the Dragon King's treasury stood apart, their scale armor reflecting the pack's light in prismatic shards, nostrils flaring as they sniffed the air for threats. Behind them, the mercenary archers had lowered their bows, but their fingers still brushed arrow fletchings. They all watched Valen as he emerged from his shop, their expressions a mix of awe, resentment, and desperate hope. "He's awake," the combat alchemist said, her voice clipped. "The architect of this disruption." Valen ignored the accusation in her tone. His focus was on the pact. He could feel it through divine craft deconstruction, a skill that now came to him with painful clarity. The ability hummed in his mind, but it felt different, thinner, as if he'd poured too much of himself into the artifact. Where once he could analyze a potion recipe with casual ease, now the effort brought a spike of headache behind his eyes. The cost of redirecting the army's aggression had been fragments of his personal tranquility, and he knew with cold certainty that he'd never again craft a simple healing draft without feeling the weight of global consequences. He approached the pact, each step sending tremors through his depleted body. The villagers parted for him, their faces filled with a reverence that made his stomach clench. Thorin, the village elder, gave a solemn nod, but his eyes held a warning: this piece was fragile, built on a knife's edge. "It needs the final integration," Valen said, his voice raspy from disuse. He didn't address anyone in particular, but the factions leaned in. The pact has stabilized the local economy, but it's still rejecting the broader systems. Too much fear, too much greed baked into the foundations. The Adventurers' Union captain snorted. "You think we don't know that? Our markets collapsed because your cheap potions made adventure loot worthless overnight. Men who risked their lives for monster cores are now begging for copper coins. And our guild's monopoly on high-grade alchemy is shattered," the combat alchemist added, her tone icy. "Decades of research, undermined by a retiree with a discount sign." One of the Dragon Kin, the largest with bronze scales, rumbled deep in his throat. "The Dragon King's hoard fluctuates with every pulse of that thing. Our wealth, accumulated over millennia, is becoming unpredictable." Valen closed his eyes, reaching out with divine craft deconstruction. He didn't need rare materials, just focus, and the feedback swirling around him. He could see the guild's fear as tangled threads of control, the union's desperation as fraying ropes of value, the Dragonkin's hoarding instinct as stagnant pools of gold. The pact glowed in his mental vision, a lattice of light waiting to weave them into something new. "Give me your grievances," he said, opening his eyes. Not as threats, but as data. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the combat alchemist stepped forward, her pride warring with necessity. She pulled a ledger from her pouch, its pages filled with complex formulas and market projections. Our profit margins have evaporated. If this continues, we'll have to lay off apprentices, close satellite guild halls. The knowledge loss alone. Valen took the ledger, his fingers brushing the pages. Divine craft deconstruction activated, and the numbers and formulas unraveled in his mind. He saw not just greed, but a genuine fear of losing centuries of alchemical advancement. He channeled that feedback into the pact, and one of its rings shifted, glowing with a soft blue light that promised sustainable research funding through decentralized grants. The Adventurers Union captain followed, handing over a worn map marked with failed trade routes. Our members can't feed their families. The old economy rewarded risk, but now. Valen analyzed the map, seeing the collapse of monster part markets and the desperation of warriors with no wars to fight. He fed that into the pact, and another ring turned emerald green, projecting images of new employment foundations, monster conservation efforts, infrastructure projects in remote regions, disaster response teams funded by microtransactions on artifact use. The dragonkin approached last, placing a single, ancient gold coin on the ground. It was cold to the touch, heavy with the weight of avarice. Our treasure must remain stable. We are not merchants to be buffeted by market winds. Valen picked up the coin, and divine craft deconstruction showed him the hoard's psychology, not just wealth, but identity, history, power. He integrated it, and a third ring burned with molten gold, establishing currency stabilization mechanisms that tied value to real-world productivity rather than speculative fear. With each integration, Valen felt another piece of his casual crafting ability wither. The headache intensified, becoming a constant throb. He could still use divine craft deconstruction, but now it would always carry this bureaucratic weight, this awareness of interconnected systems. The simple joy of turning common herbs into a perfect potion was gone, replaced by the responsibility of balancing global equations. He poured the last of his energy into the pact. The artifact pulsed, its light intensifying until it washed over the village, the surrounding forests, and beyond. The ripples became waves, visible even on the horizon. Where they passed, markets didn't just stabilize, they transformed. Shops in distant cities found their inventories automatically adjusting to demand, prices settling at fair levels that allowed both profit and accessibility. Adventurers received quest notifications for jobs that actually helped communities. Dragon hordes shimmered with a new, steady glow, their value linked to the health of the ecosystems they often guarded. The factions watched, their aggression melting into stunned silence. The combat alchemist's ledger updated in real time, showing restored margins with ethical constraints. The Adventurers Union captain's map redrew itself, marking new, sustainable trade routes. The Dragonkin's coin warmed in his hand, its value now constant but fluid, like a deep, steady river. Then the messengers arrived. From the north came a diplomat from Erelon, his robes embroidered with silver threads, bearing a sealed scroll. From the east, a messenger from Carthus, wearing practical leathers and carrying a tablet of stone. From the south, a representative from Viridia, her dress woven from living vines, holding a crystal orb. They had been waiting at the village outskirts, and now they approached as one, their faces solemn with the weight of history. The kingdoms have observed, the Erelon diplomat said, his voice carrying formal cadence. We have seen the chaos, and now the harmony. We are here to sign. They didn't need ink or parchment. The pact of prosperity lowered itself, hovering at chest height. One by one, the representatives placed their hands on its surface. The Erelon scroll dissolved into light that joined the artifact. The Carthus tablet crumbled to dust, its essence absorbed. The Viridia orb melted into the pact like dew into soil. With each contact, a soft chime echoed, and a new symbol etched itself into the artifact's rings, a silver crown for Erelon, a stone axe for Carthus, a blooming flower for Viridia. The guild, the union, and the dragonkin followed suit, their touches adding symbols of alchemical flasks, crossed swords, and dragon scales. The pact glowed brighter, its rotation slowing to a stately, eternal turn. The harmony radiating from it solidified, becoming a permanent part of the world's fabric. Economic systems would now self-correct toward fairness, rewarding innovation without allowing collapse, balancing abundance with responsibility. It was done. Valen sank to his knees, the last of his strength spent. The villagers cheered, but the sound felt distant. The factions bowed their heads, not to him, but to the new reality they'd helped create. The pact hovered, a silent guardian of prosperity. As the crowd began to disperse, Valen looked back at his shop. He needed to rest, to process the permanent loss of his simple life. But his eyes caught something odd. The sign above the door, which had always read Valen's Verdant Brews, in his own clumsy carving, had changed. The wood was the same, but the letters had rearranged themselves, burned into the grain by some unseen force. Now it read, Global Economic Hub. And below, in smaller script, as if an afterthought, potions still 50% off on Tuesdays. Valen stared, too tired to feel horror or irony. The world had accepted his creation, but it had also claimed his retirement dream. His shop was no longer a humble refuge, it was the heart of a new economic order. He wondered, with a dull ache, if he'd ever get his apron back. The morning sun painted Willow's Rest in hues of gold and amber, and Valen stood in his small garden behind the potion shop, hands buried in rich, dark soil. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming herbs, a scent he'd come to associate with peace. Around him, the village hummed with a new kind of energy, one born not from fear or desperation, but from balanced prosperity. Garrett, the farmer who'd once been skeptical of Valen's healing potion for his son Kellen, now worked alongside a Dragonkin enforcer from the Dragon King's treasury, repairing a section of the village's irrigation system. The Dragonkin's scaled hands moved with surprising delicacy as they fitted wooden pipes, while Garrett offered advice on soil drainage. Nearby, Marta, the elderly villager whose arthritis had troubled her, sat on a bench watching with a contented smile, her joints no longer aching thanks to Valen's extended shelf-life potion. Valen wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt across his forehead. His apron, once crisp and clean, was now stained with earth and herb residues, a testament to the hands-on work he cherished. The exhaustion from forging the pact of prosperity still lingered in his bones, a deep weariness that no potion could fully erase. His ability to casually craft had diminished, the divine craft deformation now requiring more focus, more intentionality than before. But as he watched Thorin, the village elder, discussing crop rotations with the scarred female representative from the Adventurers Union, Valen felt a quiet satisfaction. The wheat yields have doubled since the pact stabilized prices, Thorin was saying, his voice carrying on the gentle breeze. And with the new trade routes Valen analyzed, we're exporting surplus to Erelon without undercutting their local markets. The Adventurers Union representative nodded, her scarred face thoughtful. Our members are finding steady work as caravan guards along those routes. The desperation that drove us here, it's fading. Valen turned back to his herb bed, plucking a sprig of silverleaf mint. He brought it to his nose, inhaling its sharp, clean scent. This was what he'd wanted, simple moments, tangible work, the rhythm of seasons rather than the clamor of forges and battles. Yet the shop's new sign, Global Economic Hub, loomed in his peripheral vision, a constant reminder that his retirement had become something else entirely. Inside the shop, Elara from the Kingdom's Alchemist Guild was organizing shelves, her stern demeanor softened by the morning light filtering through the window. She'd stayed after the pact's signing, initially to monitor its implementation, but had gradually become something like an assistant, or perhaps a friend. Valen watched through the window as she carefully labeled a batch of healing potions, her movements precise, efficient. You're thinking too loudly, a voice said behind him. Valen turned to find Rorik of the Copper Fong Company leaning against the garden fence, his warrior's frame looking oddly at ease among the climbing beans and tomato vines. The adventurer-turned-ally had taken to visiting regularly, claiming he was keeping an eye on economic stability, but more often than not ending up helping with chores. Just appreciating the morning, Valen said, though the words felt incomplete. Rorik's sharp eyes didn't miss much. You sacrificed part of yourself for that artifact. I've seen that look before, on soldiers who gave too much in a battle they didn't choose. Valen didn't deny it. The divine craft deformation had always been part of him, as natural as breathing. Now it felt, thinner, like a muscle overworked and never fully recovering. When he focused, he could still analyze systems, still improve items with mundane materials, but the effortless flow was gone. The Pact of Prosperity had required channeling not just economic principles, but fragments of his own desire for peace, his own understanding of balance. And those fragments were gone forever, woven into the artifact's framework. He straightened, brushing soil from his hands. The shop needs restocking. The basic healing potions are running low. Basic, Rorik chuckled. Your basic would be another alchemist's masterpiece. But I'll help. The Dragonkin brought a shipment of common herbs from the northern valleys, said it's part of their currency stabilization contribution. Together they moved to the storage shed, where crates of herbs waited. Valen opened one, revealing bundles of sun-dried feverfew and willow bark. As he reached for a bundle, his hand hesitated. The divine craft deformation stirred, not in its old, easy way, but like a tired beast rousing from sleep. It offered analysis. The feverfuse potency could be enhanced by 30% with a simple realignment of drying racks. The willow bark contained trace minerals that, if extracted properly, could extend its shelf life by months. Valen closed his eyes, focusing. The analysis came, but with effort, with cost. A headache began to form behind his temples, familiar now since the forging. He pushed through, making mental notes for improvements. This was his life now, not the effortless god-tier crafting of legend, but intentional, costly work. Still work he loved, but different. As they carried herbs into the shop, Valen noticed the changes. The Pact of Prosperity, now a permanent fixture on the central table, glowed with a soft, steady light. Its surface, once marred by the arrow crack from the attack, now pulsed with gentle energy, the imperfection having become part of its self-correcting mechanism. Around it, representatives from the various factions moved with purpose but without urgency. The unnamed Dragonkin enforcers discussed trade quotas with the diplomat from Erelon. The Adventurers' Union captain showed the messenger from Karthus a map of secured caravan routes. Ilara looked up as they entered. "The morning reports are in," she said, her voice carrying its usual efficiency but lacking the suspicion it once held. "Erelon's grain markets have stabilized. Karthus reports a 15% increase in artisan exports without price collapse. Viridia's treasury shows the first surplus in a decade." Valen nodded, setting down his herbs. "And the local markets?" "Thriving but not overwhelming," Ilara said. "The feedback loops you built into the pact are working. Prosperity spreads gradually, without creating new monopolies." It should have felt like victory. And in many ways, it did. But as Valen moved behind the counter, tying his apron strings with practiced hands, he felt the ghost of what he'd lost. His retirement dream, the simple, anonymous life in a remote village, had transformed into something grander, more important, but also more demanding. The shop was no longer just his haven, it was the heart of a new economic order. Throughout the day, villagers and representatives came and went. Marta brought fresh-baked bread, insisting Valen needed proper nourishment. Garrett and Kellen stopped by, the young man now fully healed and apprenticing with the village carpenter. The three Dragonkin enforcers, their initial hostility completely gone, delivered another shipment of herbs and stayed to help reorganize the storage cellar. As afternoon faded toward evening, Valen found a moment alone in the garden. The headache from earlier had subsided to a dull throb, but the deeper weariness remained. He sat on the same bench where Marta had once complained about potion shelf life, looking at his hands, calloused from farm work, stained from herbs, but still capable of divine crafting, even if diminished. The divine craft deformation stirred again, not in response to an external item or system, but turning inward. Valen didn't fight it. He let it analyze his own desire, his own longing for the simple retirement he'd envisioned. The ability showed him the contradiction. He wanted his shop to remain a cozy retreat, but it had become a global hub. He wanted anonymity, but his actions had made him central to a new world order. The analysis didn't offer a solution, not immediately. But it showed him patterns, the way the villagers still treated him not as a god or an economic savior, but as Valen the potion maker. The way Ilara, despite her guild background, now brewed tea for them both in the evenings. The way the Pact of Prosperity didn't require his constant attention, having been designed to self-regulate. An idea formed, fragile at first, then solidifying. Valen stood, moving to his workbench in the corner of the garden. From a small box, he took mundane materials, a smooth river stone he'd found months ago, a strand of silverleaf mint, a drop of morning dew collected in a vial, and a fragment of clay from the pack's forging. He arranged them on the bench, then focused. The divine craft deformation activated, this time with deliberate slowness. He didn't push for god-tier results, he aimed for something simpler, more personal. The ability analyzed the materials, showing him connections. The river stone's smoothness represented peace, the mint's resilience symbolized endurance, the dew embodied renewal, the clay fragment carried echoes of the pack's balancing energy. Valen worked with careful focus, his movements precise despite his weariness. He didn't forge in the dramatic, intense way he had the pact. This was quieter, more intimate. He used the clay to bind the mint to the stone, then let a drop of dew fall onto the combination. As it soaked in, he channeled not economic principles, but personal ones, the joy of a well-tended garden, the satisfaction of a helpful potion, the peace of a quiet evening. The materials transformed, not into something flashy or powerful, but into a simple charm, a smooth stone with a mint leaf preserved within it, glowing with a soft, personal light. As Valen held it, he felt its effect, a gentle reinforcement of his original desire. The shop around him seemed to settle, its global economic hub sign still there, but feeling more like part of the village than the center of the world. The pack's energy remained present but background, like the hum of bees in a garden. He tied the charm to his apron string, where it rested against his chest. The weight was comforting, a reminder and a reinforcement. His retirement would always be intertwined with economic balance, that was the reality he'd created. But within that reality, he could still have his cozy retreat, his simple moments, his apron-clad work. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Valen stood in the doorway of his shop, watching the day's last activities. The representatives were departing for their evening accommodations. Villagers were heading home. The pact of prosperity glowed steadily on its table, maintaining balance without demanding attention. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the village, walking along the road from the direction of the distant mountains. A traveler, by the look of them, cloaked, with a staff, moving with the weary but determined gait of someone who had come far. The traveler approached the shop, stopping before Valen. They pushed back their hood, revealing a face marked not by scars of battle, but by something subtler, deeper, the kind of weariness that comes from witnessing too much suffering, too much imbalance. Their eyes held a plea that went beyond personal need. "I've traveled from the shattered lands beyond Viridia's borders," the traveler said, their voice rough with dust and distance. "The wars there ended years ago, but the scars remain, poisoned earth, broken economies, people who've forgotten how to hope. I heard there's a potion maker here who offers miracles at fair prices." Valen waited, his hand unconsciously touching the charm at his chest. The traveler's gaze dropped briefly to Valen's apron, then met his eyes again. "I don't have much coin. But I'm asking, is there a discount for a potion that can heal more than bodies? One that can help heal a land's scars, help people remember prosperity isn't just for the fortunate few?" Around them, Willow's Rest settled into evening quiet. The pact of prosperity hummed its steady song inside. Valen's garden herbs released their evening scents into the cooling air. He simply nodded, apron still on, and gestured for the traveler to enter the shop.